Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the world of Viking love letters. Except forget paper, forget ink, and definitely forget emoji. Imagine this instead. You're holding a cold, rough piece of bone or wood, a sharp knife in your other hand, and the fate of your love life depends on carving the right symbols without slicing your thumb open. Oh, and if you mess up, no backspace, no delete, just permanent shame, or worse, a curse. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and local time. Let's see how far this runic romance is reaching tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in 9th century Scandinavia, and the first thing you need to know is that runes aren't just letters, they're magic. Literally. The word rune itself comes from Old Norse rune, meaning secret or whisper, and when you carve them, you're not just writing, you're casting a spell. Think of it like texting, but if autocorrect could accidentally summon a frost giant. Your first lesson? The Futhark, the Viking alphabet. Not the cute ABCs you learned as a kid. This thing looks like a mix of stick figures and IKEA assembly instructions. There are two versions, the older 24-character Elder Futhark and the streamlined 16-character younger Futhark that most Vikings used. And here's the kicker. They didn't just write left to right. Sometimes they flipped, reversed, or even stacked runes like some kind of ancient word puzzle. Historians still argue whether this was for secrecy, style, or just because some carvers got bored. Now, let's talk materials. You'd think they'd use something nice like parchment, right? Nope. Vikings carved on whatever was handy. Bone, wood, stone, even weapons. The ribe skull fragment, for example, is a human cranium scraped smooth with a lover's message etched into it. Romantic? Gruesome? Why not both? And here's your quirky tidbit. Some runes were considered so powerful that just saying them out loud could make things happen. There's a theory that the famous Björketorp runestone in Sweden, covered in ominous runes, was basically a Viking keep-out sign. Except instead of a fence, it might have cursed trespassers with a slow, painful death. So yeah, maybe don't practice your love runes on someone else's property. You've got your knife, your piece of bone, and a heart full of Viking passion. But before you start carving love notes like some Norse Shakespeare, you need to understand, runes weren't just sweet nothings. They were dangerous. One wrong symbol, one misplaced stroke, and your romantic confession could accidentally become a death curse. Picture this. You're trying to impress your crush, so you carve alu, a common runic charm for protection and good fortune. But oops, you slip, and now it reads Olth, which might summon a very different kind of passion, like say, a blood feud. The line between love spell and hex was thinner than a Viking's patience at a slow mead hall. Historians still argue whether Vikings actually believed in rune magic, or if it was more of a psychological flex, like how we knock on wood just in case. But here's a mainstream fact. The Egil saga tells of a scorned woman who carves runes on a whalebone, then buries it where her love rival will walk, cursing her to madness. Spoiler, it works. Moral of the story, don't ghost a Viking. Now for the quirky bit, some runes were considered so potent they needed a safety lock. The Lindholm amulet, a 2nd century bone piece, has a chaotic jumble of runes that basically translates to I, the Erelaz, rune master. Inscribed this powerfully confusing mess so only the right person can decode it. Everyone else, hands off. Ancient encryption at its finest. And here's your open debate. Were love runes sincere, or just the Viking equivalent of drunk texting? The Galahus horns, 2 golden drinking horns covered in runes, sadly stolen and melted down in 1802, allegedly had romantic verses. But since they're gone, we'll never know if they said, roses are red, mead is gold, or let's raid England together, babe. The Bone Collector's Confession starts with a fragment of skull. Not exactly the most romantic stationery, but when you're a Viking you work with what you've got. This particular piece, dug up in Ribe, Denmark, has seen things. Battle scars, ritual markings, and tucked between all that, a desperate message from someone who just wanted to be loved. You run your fingers over the grooves, shallow but deliberate. The runes spell out, "Hail to thee, Odin, bring her heart to me." Not exactly subtle, but then again, Vikings weren't known for their courtship etiquette. What makes this artifact special isn't just the plea itself. but where it's carved, right beside protective charms against enemy spears. Because nothing says romance like hedging your bets between love magic and combat magic. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine love spell or more of a manifestation board situation. Carve your desires into something permanent, and the universe has to listen. Mainstream archaeology confirms the ribby skull was likely a ritual object, repurposed by someone who really needed a dating assist. Now for the weird part. Similar runes appear on a 10th century cowrib in Sweden, except that one says, "Gudrun hates me." No context, no follow-up, just centuries-old venting carved into livestock remains. The Viking equivalent of tweeting your ex at 2 a.m. And here's your open debate. Were these carvings private diaries, public displays, or something in between? The Reeb skull was found near a marketplace. Was this like writing your crush's name on a bathroom stool, or more like burying a voodoo doll where only the gods would see? Your fingers are cramping. There's a suspicious red stain on your tunic, hopefully just berry juice, and you've already snapped 2 knife blades trying to carve runes into this stubborn piece of oak. Welcome to Viking craftsmanship, where love letters require the same tools you'd use to skin a deer. Let's break down the toolkit of a 10th century romantic. The knife. Not some dainty quill knife, but a seax, the Viking multi-tool that could gut a fish, shave wood, and apparently help you slide into someone's DMs. The wider blade was for rough shaping. The tip did delicate rune work. Historians found one in York with the owner's name, Half Dan, etched into it, followed by "was here." Some things never change. The chisel, for stone carvers. Imagine trying to write, "You're beautiful like a sunrise over the fjord," while hammering a metal spike into granite. One slip and your love poem becomes an accidental epitaph. The beeswax trick, rune sticks meant for travel, like "Meet me by the third longship," got rubbed with wax to waterproof them. Modern tests show waxed runes last 3 times longer in rain. Vikings, pragmatic even in passion. Mainstream fact. The Mastemir chest, a Viking toolbox found in Sweden, contained everything from tongs to bellows, but no how to carve runes guide. They expected you to learn by doing, mistakes and all. Quirky tidbit. Some rune carvers cheated. Archaeologists found practice sticks with shaky beginner runes, including one that just says, "testing, testing," in younger Futhark. Even Vikings had rough drafts. Open debate. Did they colour their carvings? Traces of red ochre in some rune grooves suggest certain messages were painted for emphasis, like a medieval highlighter. Was "I love you" in scarlet more binding? You're holding a 12th century comb in Oslo's Museum of Cultural History, turning it over in your hands when... there. Tiny, almost invisible to the untrained eye. Kismic carved along the spine. Kiss me. This isn't some grand runestone declaration. It's small, intimate, the kind of message you'd whisper while handing someone their comb in the morning light. And that's what makes it extraordinary. Proof that Viking romance lived in everyday objects, not just epic sagas. The comb itself is walnut, teeth perfectly spaced, hygiene mattered, even to pillagers. But here's the twist. It was found in a male burial. So who was the intended kisser? A wife? A lover? A cheeky friend who thought it'd be funny to troll archaeologists centuries later? Mainstream fact. Combs are among the most common personal items in Viking graves, often decorated with runes, patterns, or animal motifs. This one just happened to wear its heart on its spine. Quirky tidbit. Another comb from Sigtuna, Sweden, bears the runes Thor Vigi. May Thor protect. Because nothing says romance like invoking the god of thunder to bless your hair care routine. Open debate. Were these combs gifts or personal items? Some scholars argue the Kismeek comb was a courtship present, the Viking equivalent of engraving a necklace. Others insist it was just someone's private reminder to shoot their shot. The mead horn slips in your grip as laughter erupts around the fire. Someone just recited a verse so scandalous that even the carved faces on the wooden pillars seem to blush. This is where Viking love letters truly come alive. Not in silent carvings, but in the honeyed, boozy heat of poetry competitions where every line walks the knife's edge between romance and roast. Skaldic poetry was the Viking art of saying "I adore you," while flexing your vocabulary so hard it could bend steel. Imagine trying to whisper sweet nothings using kennings, calling a woman fjord sunlight, because her smile glints like waves at dawn alliteration. Bjorn's bold heart beats by Brynhild's braids. Try saying that after 3 horns of mead. Metaphors so elaborate they'd make Shakespeare sigh. Your eyelashes are like the oars of my soul's ship, rowing me to bliss. Actual 10th century vibes. Mainstream fact. The Havamal, a collection of Old Norse poems, includes an entire section on love advice, like, if you find a clever woman, flirt using riddles, and don't stare at her cleavage, it makes you look desperate. Quirky tidbit. A runestick from Bergen reads, Ingebjorg loved me when I was in Stavanger, followed by a second-hand carving liar, she hates you. The original comment section clapback. Open debate. Did Vikings actually sing their runic love messages? Some linguists argue the rhythmic patterns of certain carvings match skaldic meters, suggesting they were composed to be chanted, not just read. The stick snaps in your hands as you read the words carved in jagged, angry strokes. Gunhilda left me for a man with a bigger farm. Welcome to history's most passive-aggressive breakup note, the Greenlandic love stick discovered in a 14th century Norse farmstead. Unlike the poetic flourishes of skaldic verses, this message is pure, unfiltered venting. The carver didn't bother with kennings or metaphors, just the cold, hard truth. Their heart got broken by someone with more acreage. Mainstream fact. Over 1,000 runesticks have been found at Greenland's Norse settlements. Most are mundane, shopping lists, property claims, but a solid 5% are raw emotional outbursts like this one. Turns out living in an isolated Arctic colony made people chatty. Quirky tidbit. Another Greenlandic stick reads Thordr as a goat's anus, which proves some insults are timeless. Archaeologists debate whether this was literal, was Thordr actually compared to livestock anatomy, or just Viking slang for jerk. Open debate. Were these sticks ever sent to their targets? The Greenland stick was found near its likely carver's home, suggesting some love letters were really just ancient diary rants never meant to be read. The massive gelling stones loom before you, their runes cutting deep into granite, royal propaganda at first glance, until you spot the smaller, softer message hidden in the serpent's tail. Tove made me happy. This is the Viking equivalent of a president carving his wife's initials into the Lincoln Memorial. King Harald Bluetooth, yes, that Bluetooth, erected these stones to boast about conquering Denmark and Norway. But he couldn't resist slipping in a love note to his queen, Tove. Between unified Denmark and Christianized the Danes, there's this quiet, human moment. A king admitting a woman changed him. Mainstream fact. The larger gelling stone is called Denmark's birth certificate. It's the first recorded use of the word Denmark. But historians now think Tove's mention might have been Harald's real priority. Quirky tidbit. Tove wasn't Danish, she was Slavic. Her name appears as Toffa in runes, a Norse attempt to spell her original Tova. The stone is essentially a 10th century "My foreign wife is awesome" bumper sticker. Open debate. Why hide the romantic line? Some argue it was political, showing softer emotions could make Harald look weak. Others think it was intimate, like a husband writing "I heart wife" inside his work briefcase. You're staring at a bone amulet etched with "May Freya strike you with desire when you see me," which sounds romantic until you realise it was found inside a woman's shoe. Was this a love charm? Or Viking harassment? The line between romance and coercion blurs in runic magic. Some inscriptions clearly express mutual longing, "We dreamed of each other last night on a Bergen stick," while others edge into manipulation, the Sigtuna love me spell. A lead tablet instructs the reader to carve runes, soak them in their own blood, then hide them under a couple's bed. The Galdrabok Grimoire, a 17th century Icelandic text, but with older roots, gives runic instructions to make a woman crazy for you, with a footnote warning it might backfire spectacularly. Mainstream fact. The Landnámabók recounts how a man named Kotkel used runes to curse a family, only for the spell to rebound and kill his own son. Vikings took magical blowback very seriously. Quirky tidbit. A Gotlandic picture stone shows a woman handing a man a drinking horn, while surreptitiously carving runes into it with her free hand. Talk about multitasking. Open debate. How many love runes were actually wanted by their recipients? The rib skulls, "Bring her heart to me," could be stalkerish, or a widow's desperate prayer to see her dead lover in Valhalla. The girl of stone stands in a Danish field, its surface worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Most visitors see only the obvious memorial runes. Thorstein raised this stone for his brother, but you notice the faintest irregularity near the base. Kneeling, you trace what generations missed, a tiny heart shape formed by two overlapping runes. This isn't just a grave marker, it's a secret handshake between lovers. Thorstein honoured his brother publicly and whispered to someone privately, maybe the brother's widow, maybe his own forbidden partner. The message is so subtle it begs the question, how many other Viking monuments hide intimate asides in plain sight? Mainstream fact: the Girl of Stone, circa. 900 CE is one of the earliest examples of the streamlined Younger Futhark alphabet. Its main inscription is a masterclass in runic efficiency, which makes the hidden heart even more startling. Quirky tidbit: in 2021 a laser scan revealed another concealed mark, a single F rune, fehu, meaning wealth or desire, tucked inside the heart's curve. Was this a signature? A second layer of meaning? Open debate. Archaeologists are now re-examining other memorial stones with similar scrutiny. The Ruk stone's 700-plus runes may contain acrostic love poems, if only we could decipher them. The runes look perfect at first glance. You're the light of my life carved in elegant strokes on a birchbark scroll. Then you spot the inconsistencies. The thrune is backwards, and that O is suspiciously wobbly for a professional carver. Congratulations, you've just uncovered Viking-era catfishing. Forged love runes fell into three shady categories. The prank, like the Lundbone fragment where someone altered "I love Sigrid" to "I love sheep." And yes, archaeologists found the original scraped-out version underneath. The political hack, the famous Harald is Dead runes in Norway's Misho chamber, probably carved by rivals to destabilise his kingdom. Imagine spreading breakup rumours via runic graffiti. The ego boost. Several sticks from Bergen feature self-praise. Thorgest says I'm the best lover in the fjord, likely carved by the men themselves, the ancient equivalent of writing your own Yelp reviews. Mainstream fact: the Sveriges run inscriptor catalogue documents over 200 disputed runic inscriptions in Sweden alone, some obvious fakes, others still hotly debated. Quirky tidbit: a Copenhagen museum displays a practice stick where an apprentice copied "Marry me Astrid" 6 times, with increasing desperation in the handwriting. Open debate. Was there runic identity theft? The Hunan runestone in Norway may show one man's name carved over another's, a literal stone-cold erasure of someone's romantic legacy. The amulet burns against your palm as you read the runes circling its edge. Let us be as close as fire and iron. Followed by an illustration so explicit it makes the British Museum's curator blush. This 10th century Sigtuna love charm doesn't bother with subtlety. Bronze pendants like this were the Viking equivalent of sending nudes, small, wearable, and definitely not for public display. But here's what's fascinating. The erotic imagery isn't just for shock value. Every detail is a runic pun. The intertwined bodies form a B rune, Birkanen, meaning birch, a symbol of fertility. The border's zigzag pattern mirrors the S rune, Suilo for sun and vitality. Even the clasp is shaped like an M, manners, humanity, because Vikings loved their meta-commentary mainstream fact. This amulet was found in a woman's grave near a trading post, suggesting it might have been a gift from a travelling partner, or, given the era's norms, a very bold business proposal. Quirky tidbit: a nearly identical pendant was discovered in Latvia, except the runes say, "Not tonight." Archaeologists debate whether this was rejection, humour, or a check the date on your artefact situation. Open debate. Were these worn as protection? Some scholars argue the graphic imagery warded off evil spirits, the logic being even demons have standards. The cross looms over the runestone, its shadow slicing through the words, "Gunvalda loved Astrid under Christ and Freya both." A theological contradiction carved in stone. After Christianity reached Scandinavia, love runes didn't disappear, they went undercover. You're looking at the ultimate Viking religious mashup. Jesus jams, the Kelbystone in Sweden bears a cross, surrounding a runic love spell invoking Odin's breath to bind Karin's heart. Saintly Seduction, a 12th century amulet from Trondheim, uses Latin Ave Maria alongside runic Make Her Desire Me, the medieval equivalent of quoting Bible verses on your Tinder profile. Cryptic compromises. The Ramsson carving depicts Sigurd's dragon slaying, with runes sneaking along the sword blade that translate to Ingrid thinks of me when it rains. Mainstream fact. The upland rune inscriptions show a clear pattern. Between 1020 to 1100 CE, 78% of love runes include both pagan and Christian elements. Quirky tidbit. A church wall in Gotland has Thor bless our marriage. Runes scratched under the pews, dated to 1240 CE, nearly 200 years after official conversion. Old habits die hard. Open debate. Were these carvers genuinely conflicted, or just hedging their bets? The Herstave church door has runic "Protect my wife" messages facing inward toward the congregation, but Freya guide her on the hidden outer side. You're sifting through a box of what looks like Viking trash, wood shavings, fish bones, broken pottery, when a splintered stick catches your eye. The runes are crude but clear. Bearer, meet me at the dock after dark. Bring ale. This is the Bergen Bay stick phenomenon. Hundreds of everyday wood chips, used for notes, tallies, and shopping lists that accidentally preserved Viking dating culture. Unlike the grand runestones, these were disposable, honest, and often hilarious. The booty call. If you're free tonight, I'm at Thorkel's booth. No armour needed. Briggan excavation number 249. The domestic. Buy more butter. Also you're pretty. Love, Einar. Because even Vikings understood the power of compliments with chores. The ghosting. A series of 3 sticks from the same dig. Why won't you answer my runes? Fine, I'll take Svanhild instead. Different handwriting. Good, she's richer. Mainstream fact. Over 670 rune sticks were found in Bergen's Briggen district. So many that archaeologists created a romantic correspondence category. Quirky tidbit. One stick bears a woman's handwriting, rare for the era, saying, "Tell Grim I said no." The back has a man's scrawl. She didn't say no that firmly. Open debate. Were these left intentionally in places the recipient would find them? Several were wedged into wall cracks at shoulder height. Early Viking mail slots. The knife handle fits perfectly in your palm, until you turn it over and see the runes. Gudrun's answer, never. Carved in jagged strokes that dig deeper with each letter, this isn't just rejection. It's a 10th century mic drop preserved in oak. Rejection runes took many forms, but they all shared one trait: permanence. While love notes were often carved on disposable wood, these no-thanks messages appeared on objects meant to last. Weaponized words. A sword pommel from Sigtuna reads, "Hrolf's proposal died here," with a crude grave marker symbol, home decor disses. A door lintel in Iceland bears, "All who enter agree. Helga chose wrong," followed by 15 tally marks. Apparently visitors were polled. The ultimate burn, the Oslo no-knife, yes, archaeologists named it that, has "Ask someone else" runes filed so deep they structurally weakened the blade. Mainstream fact. The Gulleting Law Code, circa 950 CE, specifically prohibited malicious rune carving against unwilling partners, suggesting this was a rampant enough problem to legislate. Quirky tidbit. A bone fragment from York shows a rejected suitor's "Fine, I'll become a monk" meltdown, with a later addendum, "Monastery full, back to fishing." Open debate. Were some rejection runes actually protective? The Herning Plank's "Not yours, never yours" message was found near a woman's bed area, possibly a boundary against harassment. The 19th century scholar adjusts his pince-nez, squinting at the runestone. Clearly, he declares, this speaks of a maiden's undying devotion. Meanwhile, the actual translation reads, "Eric took 3 goats from Ketil's farm." Good haul. Welcome to the Victorian era of runic romance, where prudish academics turned Viking graffiti into bodice ripper fanfiction. 3 ways they got it spectacularly wrong. The lover's stone that wasn't. The Ruck Stone's 762 runes, actually about a grieving father's dead son, became proof of a tragic Romeo and Juliet saga, until linguists deciphered it in 2015. Selective translation. When the Kilver Stone's Vec rune, an actual cattle count, Appeared, one 1887 paper insisted it stood for Fidelity Forever. Straight up forgery, the Vinland maps Bjarni slept here with Thora runes, later exposed as 20th century fake, inspired decades of Viking love conquests in America theories. Mainstream Fact, the first grammatical treatise, 12th century, warned that runes mislead those who don't know their double meanings. Advice Victorians ignored spectacularly. Quirky tidbit, a Yale professor's 1892 mistranslation of army provisions as bridal dowry spawned the still circulated myth of Viking wedding recipe runestones. Open debate. How many legitimate love runes were destroyed because they didn't fit Victorian ideals? The Upland Museum admits some vulgar fragments were lost during early cataloguing. The Osseberg ship's planks creak under your touch as you trace the faint runes carved between dragon heads. Sigrid owns my heart beside a crude drawing of two interlocked rings. This isn't just any Viking vessel. It's a floating time capsule of whispered confessions. Buried in 834 CE as a queen's grave, the Osberg ship hides at least 7 love messages in its woodwork. The steerboard romance. Think of me when you sail, near the rudder, where crew would have touched it daily. The secret compartment. A hidden floorboard bears what we did here, no one knows, accompanied by an arrow pointing downward. The post-mortem PS. A bedpost rune reads, "If you're reading this in Valhalla, I kept my promise." Mainstream Fact. Dendrochronology proved these carvings were made during the ship's lifetime, not just before burial, meaning these were living, breathing relationships. Quirky tidbit. One rib has "Magnhild was here" crossed out and replaced with "Magnhild was everywhere," suggesting either Viking humour or a very eventful voyage. Open debate. Were these carvings tolerated or encouraged? The captain's log area has no romantic graffiti, implying social rules about where such messages were allowed. Your fingers brush against the bark of a towering pine, feeling the grooves of runes carved at eye level. Turn east at the Twin Oaks, then follow the Fox's Den. No signature, no romantic declaration, just precise directions to a rendezvous point. This is Viking-era GPS, etched into living trees that have since grown around the messages, swallowing them whole. These arboreal love letters served a practical purpose in Scandinavia's vast forests. Landmark coding. A birch in Uppsala has "Look for the rock shaped like Thor's hammer, with an arrow pointing northwest." Time-sensitive alerts. The Ringerike ash bears layered carvings updating a meeting from after the full moon to trouble flee south. The ultimate test. One moss-covered spruce near Trondheim still shows, "If you find this, you're worthy," above a heart rune. Mainstream Fact. The Gulatingslov laws protected message trees from being cut down, with fines up to 3 silver marks for damaging them. Quirky tidbit. A 2018 study found 23% of surviving rune trees face true north, suggesting some carvers used them as compasses for their lovers. Open debate. How many trees were deliberately bent or shaped to mark locations? The Kvilliken oak, over 1,000 years old, has unnatural curves that align with 3 different runic meeting points. The laser etcher hums as it burns runes into a stainless steel wedding band, as long as this ring fits in perfect younger Futhark. Across the shop, a teenager taps their phone, sending "You okay?" in runic emoji. Viking love letters never died, they just upgraded their firmware. Modern rune romance thrives in unexpected places. Tattoo regrets. Instagram's Rune Love tag reveals thousands of eternal bond tattoos, often with hilariously wrong translations. Pro tip, triple check that soulmate doesn't actually mean sour milk. Corporate co-opting. A Copenhagen jewellery chain sells authentic Viking love runes, conveniently omitting that 80% were carved on disposable trash. Digital age echoes. The Runecast app lets you send self-destructing runic messages, basically Snapchat for people who think they're Ragnar Lothbrok Mainstream Fact. Since 2010, Iceland's Runic Marriage Certificates program has issued over 12,000 legally binding vows, written in medieval-style runes. Quirky tidbit. A 2023 study found Norwegian Tinder bios with runes receive 37% more matches, though 62% of users admit they just think they look cool. Open debate. Are we preserving tradition or creating a new mythology? The bind rune trend, merging initials into one symbol, was extremely rare historically, but now dominates Etsy's Viking section. The candle flickers as you turn the small piece of wood in your hands, smooth on one side, rough where you've just carved your first rune. It's not perfect. The W is lopsided, the D looks suspiciously like a B, but none of that matters. For the first time in hours, maybe years, you've said something honest in a language that predates countries, religions, even the concept of privacy. This is what the Vikings understood. Love runes weren't about grand gestures. They were the quiet rebellion of carving, I was here, I felt this, into a world that mostly rewarded silence. Whether on a comb, a ship's plank, or a tree that would outlive empires, they whispered, someone cared enough to leave a mark. Mainstream fact, of 3,000 plus surviving runic love messages, over 60% were carved by ordinary people, not kings, warriors, or poets. Quirky tidbit. The very last historically recorded love rune, 1599 CE, Iceland, simply says, "It's not too late," carved on a church door by a 70-year-old widow. Open debate. Why did runic love notes vanish? Not because they stopped working, but perhaps because we invented paper, then phones, then ways to unsend our truths. The wood grain feels alive under your fingertips, still warm from the knife's friction. Outside, the wind mimics the sound of waves against a longship. Or maybe it's just the fan you turned on hours ago, still humming softly in the corner. However your rune turned out, it exists now. Not hidden in a grave or buried under centuries of soil, but here, in this moment. That's the secret the Vikings never wrote down. Love letters aren't about who finds them. They're about the courage it takes to carve them in the first place. Let the candle burn a little longer. Watch how its light makes the fresh cuts glow gold. Tomorrow you can decide whether to keep this, give it away, or toss it into the sea like so many messages before it. But tonight you made something honest. Sleep well. Now we continue with peculiar punishments in medieval French villages, so you find yourself standing on the edge of a small nondescript French village, perhaps somewhere in Normandy or Burgundy, sometime around the 13th century. The sun, a watery disk in the pale sky, casts long shadows from the thatched roofs. Smoke curls lazily from stone chimneys, promising a meagre warmth inside. But the chill of the air, even in what passes for spring, bites at your exposed skin. You can almost feel the scratch of rough homespun fabric on your skin, the dampness seeping through your worn leather boots as you navigate the uneven ground. Life here, you quickly realise, isn't about comfort or convenience. It's a relentless daily struggle for existence. The days are dictated by the rhythm of the seasons, the demands of the harvest, and the ever-present eye of the local lord. Order, in this harsh landscape, isn't some abstract concept debated in grand halls. It's a tangible, often brutal necessity. Without it, the delicate balance of this precarious existence would crumble. A stray pig rooting through a neighbour's garden, a whispered accusation of theft, a quarrel over water rights. These aren't minor inconveniences. In a community living on the razor's edge of famine and disease, any disruption threatens the very fabric of survival. Imagine, for a moment, a dispute over a handful of grain when that handful could mean the difference between your family eating tonight or going hungry. Suddenly, a seemingly minor transgression takes on an almost existential weight. Historians still argue whether the severity of these punishments stemmed primarily from a genuine belief in swift retribution, or a desperate attempt to maintain control over an often unruly populace. The village itself feels ancient, even to you. The houses huddle together like frightened sheep, their walls a patchwork of wattle and daub, their windows mere slits in the rough-hewn timber. A muddy track, deeply rutted by countless carts and hooves, serves as the main thoroughfare, leading eventually to the village square. This isn't a picturesque village square with quaint cafes and charming fountains. No, this square is the heart of the village, yes, but it's also its nervous system, its public stage, and often its very painful conscience. It's where markets are held, news is exchanged, and where, as you'll soon discover, the peculiar justice of the age is dispensed with a chilling regularity. You might see a small child, nose running, clutching a wooden toy, oblivious to the ominous wooden structure. perhaps a set of stocks or even the imposing silhouette of a pillory that dominates the centre. The sheer ordinariness of these instruments of punishment, their seamless integration into the daily life of the village, is perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. It's just there, like the well or the church. The shadow that falls over you as you near the heart of the village isn't from the clouds, but from the sturdy, often forbidding presence of the Lord's manor. It stands a little apart, perhaps on a slight rise, its stone walls a stark contrast to the humble wooden dwellings of the villagers. This isn't just a big house, it's the epicentre of power, the very anchor of medieval justice. The Lord, whether he's a grizzled knight back from some forgotten skirmish, or a younger, perhaps more effete, inheritor of the fiefdom, is the undisputed law. His word is, quite literally, the law. Imagine being a small-time farmer, perhaps having lost a pig to a hungry wolf, and then having to face a lord whose mood could swing faster than a tavern door in a gale. Your fate, your family's fate, often rested entirely on his whims, his personal sense of honour, and perhaps what he had for breakfast that morning. This absolute power wasn't just theoretical, it was exercised daily. The Lord's Court, often held in a draughty hall within the manor itself, or perhaps even outdoors if the weather permitted, was where grievances were aired and judgments rendered. You might hear the murmurs of villagers gathered outside, straining to catch snippets of the proceedings, their faces a mixture of fear, curiosity, and a deep-seated resignation. There are no fancy wigs, no eloquent lawyers, no appeals process that a commoner could realistically hope to access. It's direct, it's swift, and it's often brutally effective. A few words from the Lord, a simple gesture, and your life could be irrevocably altered. It's the kind of power that makes you walk a little straighter, speak a little softer, and think twice before complaining about the price of ale. The Lord's jurisdiction stretched over virtually every aspect of village life. Disputes over land boundaries, accusations of theft, instances of assault, even moral transgressions like adultery or public drunkenness, all fell under his purview. He wasn't just a judge, he was the police, the prosecutor, and the jury all rolled into one imposing, often armoured package. This system, known as seigneurial justice, was the bedrock of medieval French society. It was efficient, yes, but fairness often took a backseat to expediency and the Lord's own interests. For instance, a common punishment for minor offences was often a fine, and guess who that money went to? Yep, the Lord. It was a rather convenient way to supplement the coffers, wouldn't you say? Historians still argue whether this system was more about maintaining social order or simply enriching the ruling class. Consider the dynamic. You, a humble villager, standing before this man who owns the land you live on, who controls the mill where you grind your grain, and who can, with a single command, expel you from your home or even worse. The power imbalance is stark, almost theatrical. He might sit on a raised dais, his face impassive, while you stand, head bowed, clutching your worn cap. His eyes scan the room, assessing not just your plea but your demeanour, your family's reputation, and how much trouble you might be to him in the future. It's a chilling reminder that in this era, your freedom, your very breath, was often a gift from the powerful. Sometimes the Lord might delegate minor judgments to a bailiff or provost, but the ultimate authority always rested with him. This system, while seemingly arbitrary, did, in its own peculiar way, maintain a semblance of order in a world that could otherwise easily descend into chaos. Without a strong hand to enforce rules, however harsh, the already precarious lives of the villagers would become utterly unbearable. Imagine a village without any consequence for stealing your hard-earned harvest. It would quickly become a free-for-all. So while you might bristle at the injustice, you also grudgingly acknowledge that the Lord's iron grip, however heavy, kept the wolves, both literal and metaphorical, at bay. Stepping further into the village square, you begin to notice the subtle yet pervasive undercurrent of fear of public shame. It's a punishment that leaves no lasting physical scar, yet can brand an individual far more deeply than any hot iron. In medieval French villages, where everyone knew everyone else's business, and probably their grandmothers too, your reputation was your social currency. Lose that, and you lost almost everything. It's like being caught in your pyjamas at the grocery store, but instead of just a few awkward glances, it's the entire village pointing and whispering for weeks, maybe even months. Talk about an effective deterrent, right? Shaming rituals were a staple of medieval justice, a highly theatrical and deeply personal way of reinforcing community norms. These weren't about locking someone away, they were about integrating the punishment directly into the fabric of daily life. Imagine the market day, usually a bustling, vibrant affair with vendors hawking their wares and farmers trading gossip. Suddenly, the usual chatter dies down as a culprit is led into the square. All eyes turn, not just out of morbid curiosity, but out of a shared understanding that this public display was a warning to them all. It's a bit like reality TV, but with much higher stakes and absolutely no commercial breaks. One common and rather humiliating tactic was the carrying of the pierre de l'opprobre, or stone of opprobrium. Imagine having to lug a heavy stone, often weighing several pounds, through the village streets, sometimes for hours on end, while everyone you knew, and everyone you didn't, stared, jeered, and perhaps even tossed a rotten cabbage or two. The weight of the stone would be nothing compared to the crushing weight of public humiliation. This was often reserved for those who had committed minor thefts, or perhaps for those who had been accused of minor public disturbances. It was a tangible penance, a walking billboard of your wrongdoing, and a constant reminder to everyone else. Don't do what this person did. Then there was the charivari, though this was more often a form of communal disapproval than an official legal punishment. If someone, say an elderly widower, married a much younger woman, or if a spouse was unfaithful, the villagers might take matters into their own hands. You'd hear a cacophony of banging pots and pans, shouting and general raucous noise outside the offending party's house, often late into the night. It was essentially a medieval flash mob, designed to make the target's life absolutely miserable, until they either conformed to social expectations or simply moved away. Historians still argue whether the charivari was a genuine expression of communal moral outrage or merely an excuse for a raucous drunken party. Either way, it certainly sent a message. These shaming rituals weren't just about punishment. They were about restoration, or at least the hope of it. The idea was that by publicly acknowledging and enduring the shame, the individual could eventually be reintegrated into the community, albeit with a tarnished reputation. There was a sense of collective catharsis too. The villagers, by participating, even as onlookers, reaffirmed their shared values and reinforced the boundaries of acceptable behaviour. It was a stark lesson, played out before your very eyes, reminding you that in a close-knit, interdependent community, your actions resonated far beyond your own doorstep. The sting of the communal gaze, the whispers, the knowing glances, these were often more painful and lasted longer than any physical lash. As you linger in the village square, your gaze inevitably falls upon the pillory. It stands there, a grim silhouette against the sky, often made of sturdy oak, its timbers weathered by countless seasons and the unfortunate souls who have occupied its restrictive embrace. This isn't just a piece of medieval furniture, it's a statement, a focal point for the Lord's justice, and a chilling reminder of how quickly one's fortune could turn. It's like a public stage, but the performance is always a tragedy, and you're the unwilling lead. The pillory, known as le pilori in French, was a simple but terrifyingly effective device designed for public humiliation and immobilization. It typically consisted of a wooden framework with holes for the head and hands, forcing the unfortunate individual to stand or stoop for hours, sometimes even days, completely exposed. Imagine being stuck like that, unable to swat away a fly or even scratch an itch, while the sun beats down or a chill wind whips through your threadbare clothes. It's like being caught in a very uncomfortable, very public, and very medieval time out, except instead of a corner, you're in the centre of town. This was a common punishment for a variety of lesser offences, often those that involved deception or public nuisance. Bakers who sold underweight loaves, merchants who cheated on scales, those who spread false rumours, or even minor brawlers could find themselves locked into its unyielding grip. The crime determined the duration, and sometimes the additional indignities. For instance, a baker caught selling shoddy bread might have a stale loaf hung around their neck, a visual aid for their transgression. It's a bit like a medieval Yelp review, only instead of a bad star rating, you get rotten vegetables thrown at your face. The true punishment of the pillory wasn't just the physical discomfort, which could be considerable, especially in harsh weather. No, the real sting came from the exposure. You were a living target for the community's scorn, their anger, and their boredom. Villagers, having little other entertainment, would often gather to gawk, hurl insults, and yes, sometimes even throw things: rotten eggs, mud, animal dung. You'd stand there, helpless, enduring the jeers and the stench, your face burning with shame, wishing the ground would simply swallow you whole. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of the pillory was deterrence or simply to provide public entertainment. It likely served a bit of both. While the pillory was a widespread instrument of punishment across medieval Europe, its specific design and usage could vary slightly from one French village to another. Some might have been single structures, others larger, able to accommodate multiple offenders at once, creating a sort of hall of shame. You might even see a particularly elaborate one, perhaps adorned with carvings or symbols of the Lord's authority, adding a layer of grim grandeur to the proceedings. The very presence of the pillory served as a constant silent threat, a stark reminder that transgression, however minor, would not go unnoticed or unpunished. It was an essential part of the medieval justice system, a tangible symbol of the Lord's power and the community's willingness to enforce its own strict moral code. From the pillory, your attention might then drift towards another, equally unsettling fixture of medieval justice: the dunking stool. Sometimes called a cucking stool, or even a trebuchet in some regions due to its lever-like mechanism, this peculiar punishment was reserved almost exclusively for women, particularly those accused of being common scolds, gossips, or unruly wives. It's like a medieval version of being sent to your room, only your room is the chilly village pond, and your bed is a wooden chair plunged repeatedly into icy water. Not exactly a 5-star spa experience, is it? You can almost hear the nervous murmuring of the onlookers as the accused, perhaps a woman known for her sharp tongue or her penchant for spreading rumours, is led towards the contraption. The dunking stool typically consisted of a chair affixed to the end of a long wooden arm or beam, which pivoted on a fulcrum. This whole assembly would be set up next to a pond, a river, or even a particularly muddy ditch. The sight of it alone would send a shiver down your spine, promising not just discomfort, but a truly public degradation. Imagine the scene. A crowd gathers, hushed with anticipation, punctuated by the occasional snicker or shouted insult. The woman is strapped securely into the chair, her dress perhaps already clinging uncomfortably to her. Then, with a creak and a splash, the arm is lowered, plunging her into the murky, frigid water. She might gasp, sputter, and struggle against her bonds, only to be pulled out, dripping and shivering, just long enough to catch her breath before being plunged back in again. This might happen several times, the duration and number of immersions determined by the severity of her alleged crime and the mood of the local authorities. It's a very physical, very immediate consequence for words, isn't it? The concept behind the dunking stool was rooted in the belief that nagging wives and gossiping women were disruptive forces in the community, upsetting the natural order. By subjecting them to this public ordeal by water, it was believed their unruly spirits would be cooled and their tongues tamed. Historians still argue whether the dunking stool was genuinely effective in curbing gossip, or merely served as a public spectacle to reinforce patriarchal control and community norms. It was certainly a powerful visual deterrent for anyone considering a bit of scandalous chatter. While primarily associated with female offenders, there were rare instances where men accused of similar public nuisances or even minor frauds might find themselves facing a cold dip. The punishment was rarely fatal, though hypothermia in colder months or accidental drowning were certainly risks. More often, the aim was to induce extreme discomfort, and more importantly, profound public humiliation. You emerge from the water, not just soaked and freezing, but utterly shamed, every eye in the village having witnessed your debasement. The memory of that chilling plunge, coupled with the communal ridicule, was intended to serve as a lasting lesson. You'd probably think twice before commenting on old Griselda's suspicious-looking chickens after that, wouldn't you? It was a peculiar watery testament to the medieval obsession with communal order and the fierce desire to control the unruly tongue. Moving on from the splash and shivers of the dunking stool, you might then spot another ubiquitous symbol of medieval village justice, the stocks. Often located right next to the pillory or near the church, the stocks were a simple but effective device for public immobility and humiliation. Unlike the pillory, which typically secured the head and hands, the stocks were designed to trap the feet, and sometimes the hands as well, forcing the unfortunate individual into an awkward, uncomfortable seated or crouching position. Imagine trying to get comfortable when your ankles are locked in solid wood, and you can't even shift your weight. It's like the world's most uncomfortable, involuntary meditation session, but with an audience. The stocks were a common punishment for a wide range of minor offences, particularly those related to public order or minor infractions against community norms. Drunkenness, petty theft, vagrancy, blasphemy, or even disturbing the peace on a Sunday could land you a few hours or even a full day in the stocks. The beauty of the stocks, from the authorities' perspective, was their simplicity and durability. A couple of sturdy planks of wood, hinged together with semicircular cutouts, and a padlock. That's all it took. And once you were in, you weren't going anywhere. Being in the stocks wasn't just about physical discomfort. It was about exposure. You were left at the mercy of the elements, baking sun, chilling rain, or biting wind, and more significantly at the mercy of the villagers. Your helplessness was amplified by the public spectacle. People would walk by, point, laugh, and perhaps even throw refuse at you. It was a potent blend of physical inconvenience and psychological torment. You can almost feel the prickle of eyes on your back, hear the snickers, and the occasional shouted insult. It's a very personal form of public shaming, where your vulnerability is on full display. Consider the indignity. You're stuck there, unable to move, unable to defend yourself, while children might gawk and poke fun, and adults whisper about your misdeeds. For a community where personal honour and reputation held significant weight, this public degradation could be a far more painful and lasting punishment than a simple fine. It effectively branded you, at least temporarily, as a societal outlier, a person who had failed to adhere to the village's strict rules of conduct. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of the stocks was truly to deter crime, or simply to reinforce social hierarchies and the authority of the Lord. The duration of your stay in the stocks depended on the severity of your offence. A few hours might be enough for a minor transgression, while a repeat offender or someone who committed a more serious public disturbance might be left there overnight. Sometimes placards detailing the crime would be hung around the offender's neck, adding another layer of humiliation. You might see a small boy tugging at his mother's skirt asking why that man is sitting so oddly, and the mother would respond with a stern, cautionary tale about the consequences of misbehaviour. The stocks, like the pillory and dunking stool, were not just instruments of punishment. They were teaching tools, grim parables acted out in the town square for all to witness. They were a constant, visible reminder that the eyes of the community and the hand of the Lord were always watching. Leaving the public squares and their grim wooden fixtures behind, you'd soon discover that medieval justice wasn't always about public spectacle. Sometimes it hit you right where it hurt the most, your purse. Fines and forfeitures were incredibly common punishments, serving as both a deterrent and, conveniently for the Lord, a significant source of revenue. Imagine losing a substantial chunk of your meagre savings because your cow wandered into a neighbour's field. It's enough to make you keep a very, very close eye on your livestock, isn't it? In a society where coinage was scarce, and wealth was often measured in livestock, land or harvested crops, monetary penalties could be devastating. These weren't just token sums, they were designed to sting, to make you feel the weight of your transgression in a very tangible way. For minor offences, a fine might be a few pennies or shillings, but for more serious matters, or for repeat offenders, the fine could escalate to the forfeiture of tools, animals, or even a portion of your harvest. It was a clear demonstration that every action had a price, and that price could be steep. Consider the ripple effect of such a punishment. If you were a peasant farmer and your single ox was seized as a forfeiture for some minor infraction, how would you plough your fields? How would you transport your goods? This wasn't just a financial setback, it was a threat to your entire livelihood, potentially plunging your family into destitution. The Lord, of course, benefited directly from these forfeitures, acquiring valuable resources that could then be used to feed his household, supply his army, or simply line his own pockets. It's a rather neat system, isn't it? Punishment for you, profit for him. Beyond direct fines, there were also various fees associated with the legal process itself. You might have to pay for the privilege of bringing your case before the Lord's court, or even pay a fee if you were found innocent just to cover the administrative costs. It's like paying for a parking ticket even if you can prove you weren't parked illegally. Talk about adding insult to injury. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for these fines was genuine justice, or simply economic opportunism, on the part of the feudal lords. Sometimes the fine might not be in coin at all. It could be a specific service you had to perform for the lord, like spending several days repairing his fences or clearing a new field. This was a form of corvée, or unpaid labour, often imposed as a punishment. So, you might escape a monetary fine, only to find yourself sweating under the sun, toiling for the very person who condemned you. It was a constant reminder of your subordinate status, reinforcing the feudal hierarchy with every swing of the pickaxe. Ultimately, fines and forfeitures underscored the inherent power imbalance in medieval society. For the common villager, accumulating even a small amount of wealth was a monumental task, and the threat of losing it, or being forced to pay a hefty fine, was a potent motivator to stay on the right side of the Lord's law. It was a subtle, yet pervasive form of control, ensuring that economic hardship remained a constant companion for those who dared to step out of line. As you consider the myriad ways a medieval lord could impact a villager's life and livelihood, one punishment stands out for its sheer finality, short of death: banishment. To be cast out of your village, your community, your very world was a terrifying prospect. Imagine being told, "You're no longer welcome here. Pack your meagre belongings and don't look back." It's like being unplugged from the only reality you've ever known, suddenly adrift in a vast, indifferent wilderness. Banishment or exile was often reserved for more serious offences that didn't quite warrant execution, but were deemed too disruptive to the community's harmony to be forgiven. Repeated theft, persistent vagrancy, sedition, or even certain moral crimes like incorrigible adultery could lead to this ultimate social death sentence. For someone whose entire identity and survival depended on their place within a tightly knit, agrarian community, being expelled was akin to a slow, agonizing demise. You were quite literally cut off from your roots. The practicalities of banishment were grim. You'd be given a set amount of time, perhaps a day or two, to gather what you could carry. Then, under the watchful eyes of the Lord's men, you'd be escorted to the village boundary. There, perhaps at a crossroads or a distinctive tree, you'd be left. No provisions, no safe passage, just the open road and the terrifying unknown. Your reputation, stained by your banishment, would precede you, making it incredibly difficult to find acceptance, work, or even shelter in another village. It's like being given a one-way ticket to nowhere, with a flashing sign on your back that says undesirable. For medieval people, who rarely travelled more than a few miles from their birthplace, the world beyond their village was largely unknown and deeply feared. It was a place of bandits, wild animals, starvation, and alien customs. To be banished meant facing these perils alone, without the protection of your kin or the familiar rhythm of village life. Many banished individuals would likely perish from exposure, hunger, or violence. Those who survived often resorted to begging or petty crime in other areas, living a precarious marginal existence. Historians still argue whether banishment was considered a more severe punishment than certain physical mutilations, given its profound psychological and existential toll. Sometimes, banishment came with specific conditions. You might be forbidden from entering a certain radius around your former home, or from setting foot in any village belonging to the same lord. Breaking these conditions would almost certainly result in a far harsher punishment, perhaps even death. The sentence of banishment wasn't just a physical removal, it was a profound psychological severing, a stripping away of identity and belonging. You can almost feel the chill wind on your back as you watch the banished figure trudge away, shoulders slumped, perhaps casting one last longing look back at the place they once called home. The silence that falls over the village after they depart is heavy, a collective sigh of relief mixed with a palpable sense of unease. For the villagers left behind, it served as a powerful, chilling reminder of the fragility of their place within the community and the absolute power of the Lord to cast them out. Having witnessed the profound social and economic consequences of banishment, your journey into medieval punishments takes an even darker turn as you encounter the grim reality of amputation. This wasn't a medical procedure to save a life. It was a brutal, public severing, a visceral deterrent designed to inflict pain, disfigurement, and a permanent mark of criminality. Imagine the horrifying sight of a limb being taken, not in a sterile operating room, but in the grime of the village square with a crowd of silent, watchful villagers. It's a scene that would make even the most hardened modern individual wince. Amputation, often of a hand, foot, or sometimes an ear, was a punishment reserved for serious, often repeat offences, particularly theft. The logic was chillingly simple. If you stole with your hand, you lost your hand. If you ran away from your obligations with your feet, you lost a foot. It was a literal interpretation of an eye for an eye, albeit with a medieval twist. The aim was not just to punish the individual, but to permanently disable them, making it impossible for them to commit the same crime again, and serving as a stark, horrifying warning to others. You might hear the distant rhythmic pounding of a blacksmith's hammer, usually a comforting sound, but here it might be the very tools being prepared for the grisly task. The surgeon was often not a trained physician but a local barber surgeon, or perhaps even the executioner himself, whose knowledge of anatomy was rudimentary at best. Anesthetics, as you know them, didn't exist. There might be some strong ale or a bit of opium to dull the pain, but the suffering was immense and undeniable. The crude instruments, the lack of sterile conditions, and the immediate risk of infection made this punishment a terrifying gamble with life itself. Consider the aftermath. The bleeding, the agonizing pain, the shock, and the profound, life-altering disability. A person who had lost a hand or a foot was instantly relegated to the fringes of society. Their ability to work, to provide for themselves or their family, was severely compromised. They became dependent on charity, a burden, or simply withered away. This was a slow form of death sentence, far more drawn out and agonizing than a quick execution. Historians still argue whether the long-term societal cost of creating disabled, dependent individuals outweighed the immediate deterrent effect of the punishment. The public nature of these amputations was crucial. They were not hidden away. They were spectacles. The Lord wanted everyone to see the consequences of challenging his authority or violating his laws. You would witness the terrible screams, the spurting blood, the raw, exposed flesh. It was a sensory assault designed to embed itself in the collective memory of the village, a gruesome lesson for all who witnessed it. The very act of showing a severed hand nailed to a gibbet or displayed as a warning was a powerful piece of visual communication in a largely illiterate society. It said, without words, "This is what happens when you steal. This is what happens when you defy the Lord." It was a chilling testament to the severity of medieval justice, a stark reminder that in these small, isolated communities, the line between justice and brutality was often blurred beyond recognition. The grotesque spectacle of amputation might leave a lasting imprint on your mind, but medieval justice found other ways to permanently mark an offender, often with a searing iron. You might then stumble upon a small, smoky corner near the blacksmith's forge, where the air is thick with the scent of burning wood and something far more acrid. Here, the practice of branding took place, a chilling ritual designed to inflict not just pain, but an indelible stigma. Imagine the sizzle, the smell, and the knowledge that this mark, this cruel tattoo, would follow you for the rest of your days. It's like getting a particularly bad, permanent mugshot, only it's seared onto your skin and visible to everyone. Branding involved pressing a hot iron, usually shaped into a letter or symbol, directly onto the skin of the condemned. This was typically reserved for repeat offenders of certain crimes, vagrants, or sometimes even those who had escaped a prior punishment. The mark served as a public identifier, a physical scarlet letter that screamed criminal to anyone who saw it. In a largely illiterate society, a visual cue like a brand was incredibly effective. You might see a V for voleur, thief, an F for felon, or perhaps a cross for blasphemy. It was a permanent record of your past misdeeds, worn for all the world to see. The process itself was agonizing. Picture the executioner, or perhaps a local official holding the glowing iron, its heat radiating visibly. The victim, often restrained, would be forced to endure the searing pain as the metal met flesh, the sound of the burn echoing in the tense silence. There were no painkillers, no sterile conditions, just brute force and the promise of infection. The wound would fester, and even if it healed, it would leave a raised, discoloured scar, a testament to the pain endured and the crime committed. Historians still argue whether the physical pain of branding was more significant than the lifelong social ostracization it brought. Beyond the immediate agony, the true cruelty of branding lay in its permanence. There was no escaping your past. Every time you met a new face, every time you sought work in a new village, that mark would betray you. You would be forever identified as a criminal, a person to be distrusted and avoided. Imagine trying to start fresh, to build a new life, when your very skin screams your history. It was a sentence that extended far beyond the immediate punishment, impacting every future interaction and opportunity. The Lord's rationale for branding was clear. It was a highly visible deterrent, a living warning to others. It ensured that anyone who had once transgressed would be instantly recognizable, making it harder for them to repeat their crimes unnoticed. You might see a person with such a brand trying to hide it with a scarf or a sleeve, but the knowing glances of others would tell you the truth. It was a constant reminder of the Lord's power and the pervasive fear of social disgrace. Branding, therefore, was more than just a physical punishment. It was a psychological weapon, designed to strip away dignity and hope. It ensured that the consequences of crime were not only remembered by the individual, but were broadcast silently to every stranger they encountered. It was a chilling testament to a system that sought not just to punish, but to permanently define and control. Having witnessed the permanent marks of branding, you might wonder how guilt was even determined in a world without forensic science or DNA. This brings us to one of the most peculiar and terrifying aspects of medieval justice: trial by ordeal. Imagine your fate, your very life, resting not on evidence or testimony, but on a supposed divine intervention. It's like a deadly game of chance, where God himself is the ultimate judge, and the stakes are literally everything. Trial by ordeal was a system of justice based on the belief that God would miraculously intervene to reveal the truth, protecting the innocent and exposing the guilty. It was commonly used when there was no clear evidence, or when a crime was particularly heinous, making human judgment seem insufficient. For a medieval mind deeply steeped in religious belief, the idea that the Almighty would personally vouch for your innocence was a perfectly logical, albeit terrifying concept. You'd probably pray harder than you ever have in your life if you knew this was coming. There were several forms of ordeal, each more harrowing than the last. You might encounter the ordeal by hot iron, where the accused had to carry a red-hot piece of iron for a certain distance, typically 9 feet. Their hand would then be bandaged, and after 3 days, if the wound was healing cleanly, it was considered a sign of God's favour and thus innocence. If it was festering, well, then you were clearly guilty. It's a bit like a medieval medical malpractice lawsuit, but the consequence of a bad outcome is much, much worse. Another common method was the ordeal by hot water, where the accused had to plunge their hand into boiling water to retrieve an object, often a stone or a ring. The same principle applied. A clean, healing burn indicated innocence, while a festering wound confirmed guilt. The sheer agony involved, the risk of permanent injury or even death from infection, made these trials unspeakably dreadful. It really puts a bad review of your local takeaway into perspective, doesn't it? Then there was the ordeal of the cross, less overtly physical but equally nerve-wracking. 2 people, the accuser and the accused, would stand before a cross with their arms outstretched. The first one to lower their arms, succumbing to fatigue or pain, was deemed to be in the wrong. This particular ordeal, however, was later condemned by the Church, leading to its decline. Historians still argue whether the outcomes of these ordeals were genuinely believed to be divine judgments, or if they were subtly manipulated by priests or officials to achieve desired results. Regardless of the specific method, the tension surrounding a trial by ordeal would have been palpable. Villagers would gather, often holding their breath, convinced that they were witnessing God's hand at work. For the accused, it was a terrifying gamble, a desperate plea to a higher power, hoping against hope that divine intervention would spare them from the horrific consequences of failure. It was a testament to a world where faith and fear were inextricably intertwined, and where justice could be as arbitrary and brutal as a roll of the dice. Following the harrowing prospect of the hot iron, your mind might still be reeling from the sheer barbarity of the ordeals. But there was another, perhaps even more psychologically chilling form of divine judgment: the water ordeal. This wasn't about scalding hands or bubbling cauldrons, but the cold, murky depths of a village pond or river. Imagine being thrown into freezing water, not to swim to safety, but to drown if you were innocent, or float if you were guilty. It's a bit like a medieval swimming test, except the passing grade means you're considered a criminal, and the failing grade means, well, you don't really have to worry about grades anymore. The water ordeal, particularly the cold water ordeal, was based on the medieval belief that pure innocent water would reject a guilty person, causing them to float, while an innocent person, being pure, would sink. The idea was that the water, being God's creation, would instinctively recoil from the corrupting influence of sin. So if you sank and drowned, you were deemed innocent, posthumously of course, and your soul was saved. If you floated, you were clearly guilty, and then you'd face earthly punishment, likely execution. It was a no-win situation, really, a true catch-22 of medieval justice. You can almost feel the chill wind whipping off the surface of the pond as the accused, often bound hand and foot, is brought to the water's edge. The village priest would typically bless the water, invoking God's judgment. Then, with a collective gasp from the assembled villagers, the person would be cast into the depths. The tension would be unbearable, the silence broken only by the splashes and the frantic struggles of the victim. Every eye would be fixed on the water, waiting for the verdict delivered by buoyancy, or the lack thereof. This ordeal was particularly fraught with peril. Even if deemed innocent by sinking, the likelihood of drowning was extremely high. And if you floated, well, your fate was sealed anyway. It highlights the peculiar logic of the age, where spiritual salvation often took precedence over earthly survival. Historians still argue whether the outcomes of these water ordeals were genuinely believed to be divine intervention, or if they were subtly manipulated by priests or officials to achieve desired results. For instance, the way a person was bound, or the depth of the water, could certainly influence the outcome. The water ordeal wasn't just a physical test, it was a profound spiritual one. For the accused, it was a moment of ultimate reckoning, a desperate plea to God for mercy and truth. For the community, it was a terrifying demonstration of divine justice, reinforcing their belief in a vigilant and judgmental higher power. It was a bizarre yet deeply ingrained part of the medieval legal landscape, a testament to a time when the boundaries between natural law, human law, and divine will were incredibly fluid and often terrifyingly fatal. It certainly makes you appreciate modern plumbing, doesn't it? And perhaps due process. Having navigated the chilling depths of the water ordeal, you might now hear hushed whispers about a different kind of justice, one rooted not in divine intervention, but in the power of words and community ties, compurgation. This peculiar legal process was like a medieval popularity contest, where your fate depended less on tangible evidence and more on the sworn oaths of your neighbours. Imagine being accused of something, and your only defence is convincing a dozen of your friends to vouch for your character. It's certainly a unique spin on a legal defence, wouldn't you say? Compurgation, also known as oath-helping, was a prevalent method for determining guilt or innocence in certain cases, particularly those involving minor disputes or when direct evidence was scarce. The accused would swear an oath of innocence, and then a specific number of oath-helpers or compurgators, often 12, mimicking the number of apostles, would swear that they believed the accused's oath to be true. These weren't necessarily witnesses to the actual event. Their role was to attest to the defendant's good character and credibility. It was less about what you did and more about who you were in the eyes of your community. The selection of compurgators was crucial. They had to be reputable members of the community, often peers of the accused, and ideally individuals known for their honesty and piety. The sheer act of finding enough people willing to publicly vouch for your character, especially in a small gossip-prone village, was a trial in itself. If you couldn't gather the required number of oath helpers, or if their reputations were questionable, your chances of acquittal plummeted. It was a very public display of social standing and trustworthiness. Historians still argue whether compurgation primarily served to resolve disputes peacefully, or if it perpetuated existing social biases and inequalities. The process would be solemn, often taking place in the Lord's Court or even the church. The accused would stand, perhaps nervously, and recite a formal oath of innocence. Then, one by one, their compurgators would step forward, each swearing a similar oath, echoing their belief in the defendant's truthfulness. The weight of these collective oaths was immense. In a deeply religious society, to swear a false oath was a grave sin, risking not just earthly punishment but eternal damnation. The pressure on both the accused and their oath helpers was considerable. It certainly puts a different spin on, can I get a witness? This system highlights the communal nature of justice in medieval times. Your individual fate was often inextricably linked to your standing within the group. A person with a history of good behaviour, strong family ties, and respected connections stood a much better chance of acquittal through compurgation than a newcomer or an outcast. It's a bit like a medieval credit score, but instead of finances, it's your moral standing that's being judged. While it might seem arbitrary to modern eyes, compurgation played a vital role in maintaining social cohesion. It provided a mechanism for resolving disputes without resorting to violence or endlessly drawn-out trials. It also reinforced the importance of reputation and communal trust, reminding everyone that their actions, good or bad, were always under the watchful eye of their neighbours. It was a system that truly emphasised that in medieval French villages, your character was your most valuable asset. From the communal support of compurgation, your understanding of medieval justice would be incomplete without recognising the pervasive influence of the church. You might then find yourself stepping into the cool, shadowed interior of the village church, its ancient stones radiating a sense of enduring authority. Here, in the realm of ecclesiastical courts, justice wasn't about land disputes or stolen chickens, but about the very state of your immortal soul. Imagine being judged not by a lord, but by a priest, for sins rather than crimes. It's a completely different kind of tribunal, focused on salvation as much as punishment. The church, in medieval France, held immense power, often rivaling or even surpassing that of the local lord. Its jurisdiction extended over a vast array of matters, particularly those considered to be moral transgressions or sins: adultery, blasphemy, heresy, witchcraft. Though this would evolve later into a more secular domain. Usury, violations of church holidays, disputes over tithes, and even matrimonial issues all fell under the watchful eye of the ecclesiastical courts. It was, in essence, the moral police of the medieval world, ensuring that spiritual laws were upheld with the same rigour as temporal ones. The proceedings in an ecclesiastical court differed significantly from the Lord's secular justice. While they could impose severe penalties, including excommunication, which, for a medieval person, was a terrifying prospect, cutting you off from God's grace in the community, they generally leaned more towards penance and spiritual correction than physical mutilation or execution. You might be ordered to perform public acts of penance, like standing barefoot at the church door during Mass, or undertaking a pilgrimage to a holy site. These weren't exactly fun weekend getaways. They were arduous journeys designed to purify your soul through suffering and devotion. It's like having to run a marathon as punishment for skipping church, but way more intense. A key aspect of ecclesiastical justice was the emphasis on confession and repentance. Unlike the secular courts, where guilt was often established through ordeal or witness testimony, the church actively sought a sinner's confession, believing it was the first step towards spiritual redemption. This often meant long, intense interrogations aimed at breaking down the accused's resistance and guiding them towards admitting their sins. Historians still argue whether these confessions were always genuine or often coerced by the immense spiritual pressure exerted by the clergy. The punishments, while often less physically violent than those from the Lord's court, could be incredibly psychologically damaging. Excommunication, for instance, meant you could not receive sacraments, be buried in consecrated ground, or even associate with other Christians. For someone in medieval society, this was a living death, a terrifying ostracization that could lead to complete social ruin. You would be shunned, isolated, and regarded as a pariah, literally cut off from the body of Christ. It's like being unfriended by everyone you know, permanently, and with the added threat of eternal damnation. So while the Lord's court dealt with your body and your property, the ecclesiastical court aimed squarely for your soul. It was a pervasive, often unseen force in medieval village life, reminding everyone that even their thoughts and private actions were subject to a higher scrutiny, and that the ultimate judgment awaited them beyond this earthly realm. From the solemn judgments of the Church, your path through medieval justice leads you to a more chilling and pervasive dread, the whispers and outright accusations of witchcraft. While the major European witch hunts primarily surged in the later medieval and early modern periods, the seeds of suspicion and fear were certainly present in earlier French villages. Imagine living in a world where an unexplained illness, a crop failure, or a sudden death could be attributed not to natural causes, but to the malevolent intentions of a neighbour. It's a truly terrifying thought, isn't it? In these close-knit, superstitious communities, The line between folk medicine, pagan practices, and outright demonic pacts was often blurred. A woman who knew a bit too much about herbs, or an old crone who lived alone and muttered to herself, could easily become the target of suspicion if misfortune struck. The concept of witchcraft, though not yet fully codified into a widespread legal offence in the earlier medieval period, still ignited deep-seated fears and led to informal, yet brutal, forms of communal justice. You might hear stories whispered by the hearth about strange disappearances, unexplained lights, or animals behaving oddly, all attributed to dark magic. Accusations of witchcraft were often fueled by paranoia, personal grudges, or a desperate need to explain the inexplicable. If a cow suddenly stopped giving milk, or a child fell ill with a fever, it was far easier, and perhaps more comforting, to blame a malevolent force than to accept the harsh realities of disease and agricultural failure. The accused, typically women, would find themselves ostracised, verbally abused, and often subjected to various forms of informal ordeals at the hands of their fearful neighbours. It's like being targeted by a particularly nasty rumour mill, but the consequences are life-threatening. While formal trials for witchcraft became more standardised later, early medieval French villages sometimes employed their own methods of discerning guilt. Remember the water ordeal from earlier? That particular method, based on whether the accused floated or sank, was sometimes used informally in suspected cases of witchcraft, with floating often interpreted as a sign of demonic assistance. It's a cruel irony, isn't it? Sink and you drown, but you're innocent. Float and you survive the water, but you're deemed guilty, and likely face an even worse fate. The fear of witchcraft highlights the deep-seated anxieties of medieval life. The world was perceived as a battleground between good and evil could manifest itself in many forms, including through human agents. The Church, too, played a role, gradually developing its doctrines on heresy and demonic influence, which would later provide the framework for systematic witch hunts. Historians still argue whether the initial accusations of witchcraft were primarily driven by genuine spiritual belief or by societal pressures and power dynamics within the community. You can almost feel the tension in the air as you pass a solitary cottage on the edge of the village, its windows dark, its door firmly shut. The whispers about the old woman who lives there, her strange cat, and the unusual herbs drying near her doorway hang heavy in the air. In a world fraught with hardship and uncertainty, the spectre of witchcraft offered a terrifying explanation for suffering and a convenient scapegoat for collective anxieties. Having touched upon the anxieties surrounding witchcraft, you might think humans were the only ones held accountable in medieval French villages, but then you'd be wrong. Prepare yourself for one of the most truly bizarre chapters in medieval legal history, animal trials. Imagine a pig squealing in terror dragged into a courtroom, or a rat, caught in a cage, being formally prosecuted for damages. It's like something out of a very strange, very old fable, but these events were very real and often very serious. Yes, you heard that right. Animals, pigs, cows, dogs, even insects and vermin, were sometimes brought to trial in medieval courts, accused of crimes ranging from murder and assault to property damage. The logic behind this peculiar practice was rooted in the medieval worldview, where animals, particularly domesticated ones, were seen as having a certain moral agency, capable of understanding right from wrong. If a pig mauled a child, it wasn't simply an unfortunate accident. It was an act that demanded justice, just as if a human had committed it. It certainly makes you wonder about the legal rights of your pet hamster, doesn't it? The process itself was surprisingly formal. The accused animal would be arrested, sometimes held in jail, and then brought before a human court, often a lord's secular court, but occasionally an ecclesiastical one, especially if the animal was believed to be demonically possessed. Lawyers, often rather skilled ones, would be appointed to both the prosecution and the defence. You might hear the droning voice of a prosecutor detailing the pig's heinous actions, perhaps with graphic descriptions of its alleged crime, followed by a defence attorney arguing for the animal's innocence or its lack of understanding. The absurdity of it all would be almost comical if the stakes weren't so high. Pigs were by far the most frequent defendants, especially in cases of infanticide. This wasn't because medieval pigs were inherently more violent. It was because pigs often roamed freely, sometimes entering homes, and sadly incidents of them attacking or consuming unattended infants were not uncommon. Other animals might be tried for goring a human or for destroying crops. The punishments, if found guilty, were as real and grim as those for humans. Execution, often by hanging, sometimes by burning, and occasionally banishment. Imagine the village executioner preparing to hang a dog, a truly surreal and unsettling sight. The community's response to these trials was a complex mix of fear, superstition, and a genuine desire for justice. For them, it was not merely a show, it was a necessary ritual to restore order and appease divine wrath. A crime, regardless of the perpetrator, was a stain on the community, and it had to be ritually cleansed. Historians still argue whether animal trials were a genuine reflection of medieval legal thought, or merely a way for authorities to demonstrate their control and reassert social order. You might even see a local priest performing an excommunication ritual on a swarm of locusts or a plague of rats, formally condemning them for their destructive acts against God's creation. It was a world where the sacred and the mundane, the rational and the superstitious, intertwined in ways that baffle the modern mind. These animal trials stand as a peculiar monument to a time when humanity sought to impose its understanding of law and morality on every aspect of existence, even the beastly. Leaving behind the surreal scenes of animal trials, you'd soon realise that some punishments in medieval French villages left no physical mark, yet inflicted a pain so profound it could shatter a person's very existence. Infamy. This wasn't a fine or a flogging, it was a social death sentence, a public stripping away of honour and reputation that left you a pariah in your own community. Imagine being alive, walking among your neighbours, but treated as if you no longer existed, as if your very presence tainted the air. It's like being permanently unfriended by everyone you know, but in a world where unfriending meant losing your livelihood and your dignity. Infamy, or the state of being publicly disgraced, was a powerful social weapon. In a hierarchical and communal society, your honour was paramount. It dictated your standing, your trustworthiness, and your ability to interact within the complex web of medieval relationships. To be branded infamous was to lose all of this. It was a consequence for certain crimes, particularly those involving perjury, fraud, or acts of cowardice or betrayal that brought shame upon a family or the community. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about cleansing the social body of a perceived corruption. A formal declaration of infamy might be pronounced by the Lord's Court, sometimes accompanied by symbolic acts designed to underscore the loss of honour. You might have your shield defaced, your coat of arms broken, or your name publicly struck from records. For a knight or a noble, this was arguably worse than death, as it meant their legacy, their family's name, was forever tarnished. For a common villager, it meant being systematically excluded. No one would trade with you, no one would speak to you, and no one would offer you aid. You became an untouchable, a ghost haunting the familiar streets of your own village. It's a medieval version of being cancelled, but with far more dire and irreversible consequences. The psychological toll of infamy would be immense. Imagine walking through the market, the silence that falls as you approach, the averted gazes, the hurried whispers. Your very presence would be a source of discomfort and suspicion. Children would be warned away from you, and doors would close as you passed. Your ability to marry, to find work, to participate in communal events, all would be severely curtailed if not entirely blocked. You were, in essence, a living dead man, or woman, condemned to wander among the living without truly being a part of them. Historians still argue whether the concept of infamy was a truly moral judgment or a convenient tool for social control and the maintenance of power structures. Sometimes infamy was a consequence of a physical punishment itself. A public flogging or time in the stocks didn't just inflict pain, it stripped away your dignity, casting you as infamous in the eyes of your peers. The stain of such a punishment, however temporary physically, could linger for years, if not a lifetime. The memory of your humiliation would precede you, making it difficult to rebuild your reputation. Ultimately, infamy served as a potent deterrent, perhaps even more so than the threat of physical pain for many. It played on the deep human need for belonging and acceptance. To be stripped of that, to be made an outsider in your own world, was a torment designed to break the spirit, leaving a lingering shadow that time could rarely erase. From the crushing weight of infamy, your mind might naturally turn to the ultimate earthly consequence, the end of the line for medieval justice. This brings us to the chilling presence of the executioner and the grim craft he plied. While not always a public spectacle in every instance, the threat of capital punishment and the man who carried it out loomed large over every medieval French village. Imagine living in a world where the penalty for certain transgressions wasn't just a fine or a flogging, but the severing of your very existence. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? The executioner, often known as the bourreau in French, was a figure of both fear and necessity. He was an outcast, living on the fringes of society, often dwelling outside the village walls or in a designated isolated house. His profession, though vital for upholding the Lord's authority and maintaining order, was considered defiling. No one wanted to associate with him, touch him, or even share a drink with him. He was the hand of ultimate justice, yet paradoxically a moral pariah. It's like being the most important, yet least popular, person at a party you never wanted to attend. His grim craft encompassed a variety of methods, depending on the severity of the crime and the status of the condemned. For commoners, hanging was the most frequent form of execution, often carried out on a gibbet erected on a prominent hill outside the village, visible for miles as a stark warning. You can almost feel the chill as you imagine the rough wood of the gallows, swaying slightly in the wind, a silent testament to the Lord's power. Thieves, murderers, and rebels often met their end this way. For crimes considered particularly heinous, or for certain types of offenders, other methods might be employed. Beheading was often reserved for nobles or those of higher status, considered a more honourable death than hanging. The swift, clean cut of the sword or axe was, in theory, less agonising. Sometimes, for crimes like arson or heresy, burning at the stake was the chosen method, a truly horrifying spectacle designed to purify the soul through fire and serve as a terrifying deterrent against similar transgressions. Imagine the crackling flames, the rising smoke, and the palpable fear in the air, a scene designed to instill absolute terror. The executioner wasn't just a butcher, he was often a skilled craftsman, maintaining his ropes, blades, and other gruesome tools with meticulous care. His trade might be hereditary, passed down from father to son, trapping generations in this cursed but necessary profession. He might also be responsible for other forms of punishment such as branding, flogging, or even the grisly work of amputation, making him the central figure in the village's darkest rituals. Historians still argue whether the public nature of executions truly deterred crime, or if it merely desensitized the populace to violence. The public execution was a major event in medieval village life, drawing crowds from miles around. It was a macabre form of entertainment, a moral lesson, and a powerful demonstration of the Lord's absolute authority. You would see faces in the crowd etched with fear, curiosity, and perhaps a strange sense of satisfaction that justice, however brutal, had been served. It was a chilling reminder that in this harsh world, the ultimate price for defiance was your very life, paid at the hands of the executioner. As the chilling image of the executioner fades from your mind, you're left to ponder the pervasive impact of these peculiar punishments on the very fabric of medieval French villages. The legacy of fear wasn't just a fleeting emotion, it was a deeply ingrained aspect of daily life, shaping behaviours, relationships, and the collective psyche of the populace. Imagine growing up in a world where public shaming, physical mutilation, or even death could be a consequence for seemingly minor infractions. It certainly puts a different spin on playground rules, doesn't it? The constant threat of these harsh penalties fostered a culture of vigilance and conformity. Villagers learned, often from a very young age, the precise boundaries of acceptable behaviour. They understood that stepping out of line, gossiping too much, or even appearing too prosperous could draw unwanted attention from the Lord or their neighbours. This created a peculiar tension, a strong sense of community interdependence, mixed with a pervasive undercurrent of suspicion and self-preservation. You can almost feel the quiet hum of unspoken rules, the subtle glances exchanged when someone pushed the boundaries too far. This fear wasn't always about outright rebellion. It was often about maintaining a precarious existence. A farmer wouldn't steal a neighbour's goat not just because it was wrong, but because the consequences, a lost hand, public humiliation, or even banishment, could mean destitution and death for his entire family. The punishment served as vivid, tangible lessons, etched into the collective memory through public spectacles. Every pillory, every gibbet, every dunking stool was a constant reminder of the consequences of challenging the established order. Historians still argue whether this deep-seated fear suppressed genuine social grievances or merely ensured a relatively stable, albeit brutal, social hierarchy. The power of the Lord, backed by these fearsome judicial instruments, was absolute. He didn't need a large standing army to maintain control. The very threat of his justice was often sufficient. This ensured that the feudal system, with its inherent inequalities, remained largely unchallenged. The common folk, preoccupied with survival and terrified of retribution, rarely dared to question the authority that governed their lives. It's a stark contrast to modern societies, where individual rights and freedoms are often debated and upheld. Yet, amidst the fear, there was also a strange form of collective resilience. The villagers, by enduring these spectacles, reaffirmed their own adherence to the rules. They participated, sometimes actively, sometimes passively, in the enforcement of communal norms. The punishments, however brutal, provided a sense of order in a chaotic world, a grim predictability that allowed life to continue, day by day, harvest by harvest. Remember that baker in the pillory. His public humiliation was a shared experience, a story that would be recounted by the fire, a cautionary tale for generations. The peculiar punishments of medieval French villages left a lasting legacy, a deep imprint on the cultural memory that persisted long after the stocks rotted and the gallows fell. They remind us of a time when justice was swift, often harsh, and deeply personal, and where the line between maintaining order and inflicting suffering was often blurred. They whisper a story of a world where fear was a constant companion, but also, in a strange way, a silent architect of stability. Now, as the long shadows of evening stretch across the fields and the sounds of the medieval village begin to soften, we ease away from the harsh realities of those peculiar punishments. The scent of wood smoke, no longer acrid with the memory of burning flesh, now carries only the comforting promise of supper fires. The chill in the air isn't from the fear of the stocks or the pillory, but simply the gentle descent of night. Remember the fear that lingered, a constant companion to these villagers. That pervasive sense of unease, that watchful eye on every action, it's starting to recede now, like a tide pulling back from the shore. The distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, which once might have conjured images of amputation, now sounds simply like the diligent work of a craftsman finishing his day. The world we've explored, with its brutal clarity of justice and its peculiar methods of maintaining order, starts to feel more distant, more like a half-remembered dream. You can imagine the villagers now, returning to their humble homes, perhaps sharing a meagre meal by the flickering light of a hearth, their conversations hushed, their lives undeniably shaped by the knowledge of what could happen if they strayed. They survived, not just the daily grind of peasant life, but the constant, unspoken threat of the Lord's justice. They learned to navigate its complexities, to respect its boundaries, and to find solace in the small routines of their lives. The whispers of gossip and the anxieties about witchcraft, they too begin to fade into the deeper quiet of the night. The images of the pillory, the dunking stool, the raw wounds of branding, they soften in your mind. They become echoes of a past, a testament to a human history that was both brutal and ingenious in its quest for order. We can almost hear the soft rustle of leaves as a gentle breeze sighs through the trees, a soothing counterpoint to the dramatic tales of trials and public shaming. The air grows heavier, not with dread, but with the quiet contemplation of a world so different from our own, a world where the lines between punishment and spectacle were often indistinguishable. The peculiar punishments of medieval French villages, while undeniably harsh, also tell us a story of human endurance, of communities striving to survive in a challenging world, and of the complex ways societies define and enforce their understanding of right and wrong. As the final embers of our journey glow softly, we leave behind the fear and the spectacle, carrying with us only the quiet understanding of a time long past, a time when justice wore a very different face. Now we start on strange medieval laws about stolen bread. So you're standing in a medieval village square, the year is roughly 1250, and the air hums with the chatter of merchants and the clop of horse hooves. Bread, the heartbeat of every meal, is more than food here. It's survival, status, and even a spark for divine judgment. Stealing it? That's not just a crime. It's a middle finger to the social order. Let's start with the punishments, because, oh boy, they were wild. If you snatched a loaf from a baker's stall, you could face fines so steep you'd be selling your only cow to pay them. A mainstream fact to ground us. In England, the Assize of Bread and Ale, set up in 1266, regulated bread prices and weights, and breaking these rules, or stealing, was a big deal. Fines were common, but for repeat offenders, things got uglier. You might be dragged to the pillory, your neck and wrists clamped in a wooden frame while townsfolk pelted you with rotten vegetables. Sounds fun, right? Now, here's a quirky tidbit. In some towns, like in parts of 13th century France, bakers could legally demand a theft tax from anyone caught nicking their bread, a fee to avoid worse punishment. Imagine paying your victim to not rat you out. Historians still argue whether this was clever justice or just bakers hustling for extra coin. Either way, it shows how bread wasn't just food, it was power. You, standing there with your rumbling belly, might think twice before grabbing that loaf, knowing the baker's got the law and the village mob on his side. The penalties varied by region, and that's where it gets spicy. In England, you might lose a hand for stealing bread if you were a repeat offender, especially during famines when grain was worth more than gold. Chop chop, no second chances. Over in Germany, some towns went full theatrical. Thieves were paraded through the streets with the stolen loaf tied around their neck like a shameful necklace. You're walking that walk of shame, kids pointing and laughing, and you're wondering if it was worth it for a stale crust. Spoiler, it wasn't. But let's not get too cozy with the physical punishments yet. Some places got creative. In certain Italian city-states, you might be branded with a hot iron, a mark on your face screaming thief to anyone who saw you. Good luck getting a job after that glow-up. Why so harsh? Bread was life. Most folks ate it at every meal. Peasants, lords, even monks. Stealing it wasn't just taking food, it was messing with the community's survival. During lean years, when crops failed, a single loaf could feed a family for days. You, the would-be thief, are up against a system that sees your crime as a betrayal of everyone, and don't think you could just apologise and walk away. Courts were quick, and justice was public. You'd be lucky to escape with just a fine and a sore ego. Speaking of egos, here's a light joke to keep us grounded. Why did the medieval thief steal bread? Because he needed the dough. Okay, bad pun, but you get it. Bread was currency, and stealing it was like robbing a bank. As you stand in that village square, the baker's eyes boring into you, you feel the weight of those laws, the crowds watching, the bread's tempting, and the consequences. They're looming like a storm cloud. Ready to risk it? Let's see what happens next. You're still in that medieval village square, the smell of fresh bread pulling at your senses like a siren song. The market around you buzzes with life, vendors hawking cabbages, a blacksmith's hammer clanging, and a gaggle of geese waddling through the mud. Your stomach growls loud enough to make a nearby merchant smirk, and those golden loaves on the baker's stall are calling your name. You're tempted, aren't you? One quick grab, and you could be munching on that crusty goodness. But hold up, those medieval laws we talked about last time, they're watching you like a hawk, and this marketplace is a minefield of temptation and trouble. Let's paint the scene. It's a crisp morning, maybe 1270, and the market is the heart of the village. Stalls are crammed with goods, apples, wool, and of course bread in every shape. Rye rounds, barley loaves, and the fancy white manchi bread for the rich folks. You're dodging elbows and muddy puddles, eyeing the baker's table. The mainstream fact here is that markets like this were tightly regulated. In England, the Assize of Bread and Ale set strict rules on how much bread could cost based on grain prices. Stealing wasn't just a personal crime, it messed with the whole economic system. One loaf gone could spike prices or spark a riot. No pressure, right? Now, here's a quirky tidbit. Some bakers, especially in smaller French towns, would mark their loaves with unique symbols, a cross, a swirl, or even a crude fish shape, to catch thieves. If you stole a loaf and got caught munching it, that symbol was like a medieval barcode screaming, "This guy stole from Pierre!" Historians still argue whether these marks were more about branding or snitching, but either way they made stealing riskier. You're eyeing a loaf with a little star carved into its crust, and you can't help but wonder if it's worth the gamble. The market's chaos is your cover, but it's also your trap. Bakers aren't just selling, they're watching. Some hire boys to stand guard shouting, "Thief!" at the first sign of trouble. You see one kid, barely 10, glaring at you like he's the king's own sheriff. If you snatch that loaf, you're not just dodging the baker, you're dodging the whole crowd. Markets were social hubs, and everyone knew everyone. Try running, and you'll have a mob on your tail faster than you can say sourdough. And let's not forget the smell, that warm, yeasty aroma that makes your knees weak. It's like the bread's taunting you, saying, "Go on, take me, see what happens." Here's a quick joke to lighten the mood. Why don't medieval bakers trust anyone? Because they know you're just loafing around. But seriously, the temptation is real. You're hungry, maybe haven't eaten in days, and that bread is so close you can almost taste it. The problem? The law's closer. If you get caught, you're looking at fines, public shaming, or worse. Remember that pillory from last time? It's right over there, in the corner of the square, waiting for you. And don't think you can blend into the crowd. Those nosy neighbours know your face, and gossip travels faster than a horse cart. The market's rules weren't just about theft. They were about control. Bread was so vital that towns had officials like ale conners or bread weighers who checked loaves for size and quality. If a baker sold you a short-weighted loaf, he could end up in the pillory, but if you stole one, that's on you. The system was rigged to keep everyone in line. Bakers, buyers, and hungry wanderers like you. You're weaving through the stalls now, the baker's eyes flickering your way. Do you risk it? Or do you keep walking, stomach rumbling, knowing one wrong move could land you in a world of medieval hurt? You're still weaving through that crowded medieval market, the scent of bread clinging to the air like a cruel tease. The baker's stall looms ahead, those golden loaves practically glowing under the morning sun. But you're not foolish enough to grab one. Yet. Your stomach's growling louder than a tavern brawl, and every step past that stall feels like a test of willpower. Last time, you saw how this marketplace is a trap for the desperate, with its watchful bakers and nosy crowds. Now, let's dive into the world of the bakers themselves, because they weren't just tossing dough in ovens, they were guarding their bread like dragons hoarding gold, bound by a strict code that kept thieves like you at bay. Picture the baker, sweaty and flour-dusted, his hands scarred from years of wrestling hot ovens. He's not just a craftsman, he's a gatekeeper of the village's lifeline. The mainstream fact here is that bakers in medieval Europe, especially in England under the Assize of Bread and Ale of 1266, followed rigid rules on bread weight and price. If their loaves were too light or overpriced, they'd face fines or worse, public shaming in the stocks. But these rules also protected them. Stealing from a baker wasn't just a crime against him, it was a crime against the king's law, and he had the right to drag you to court faster than you could chew. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some German towns, bakers had a bizarre anti-theft trick. They'd bake tiny, cursing loaves, laced with bitter herbs, leaving them out to tempt thieves. Bite into one, and you'd be spitting and gagging, marked as a culprit by your own misery. Historians still argue whether these were real deterrents or just bakers having a laugh at thieves' expense. Either way, you're eyeing that innocent-looking loaf on the stall, wondering if it's secretly a trap. Is it worth the risk, or is that baker smirking because he knows something you don't? The baker's code wasn't just about following laws, it was about survival in a cutthroat trade. Bakers worked long hours, starting before dawn to knead dough by candlelight, their shops filled with the creak of wooden paddles and the hiss of ovens. They couldn't afford to lose a single loaf, not when grain was scarce and customers were picky. You're watching the baker now, his eyes darting between you and the crowd. He's not just selling bread, he's enforcing order. If you snatch a loaf, he's not chasing you himself. He's got the market guards, the crowd, and even the law on his side. Steal from him, and you're stealing from the whole system. Let's lighten things up with a joke. Why was the baker so grumpy? Because his bread was always getting pinched. But honestly, you can't blame him. His livelihood depends on those loaves, and the code he follows is ironclad. Some bakers even joined guilds, powerful groups we'll dig into later, that set their own rules, like requiring apprentices to swear oaths not to steal dough. You're tempted, sure, but the baker's not some soft target. He's got tricks from marked loaves to those sneaky herb traps, and he's ready to make you regret crossing him. As you linger near the stall, you notice the baker's scales used to weigh every loaf to prove it meets the law. Cheat the scales, and he's in trouble. Steal from him, and you're the one in the mud. The market's still buzzing, kids running underfoot, a dog sniffing at crumbs. You're hungry, the bread's right there, but the baker's code is like an invisible wall. Do you dare test it? Or do you shuffle on, dreaming of a meal that won't cost you your freedom. You're still in that medieval market. The baker's stall, a dangerous temptation, just steps away, its loaves taunting you with their warm, crusty promise. You're hungry, your fingers itching to grab something, but you know the baker's code. Those ironclad rules from last time means he's not messing around. One wrong move, and you're not just facing his wrath, you're up against the whole medieval justice system. Now let's say you ignored every warning and swiped that loaf. You're caught, and things are about to get weird. Welcome to the world of trial by ordeal, where stealing bread doesn't just land you in court, it might have you proving your innocence to God himself. Picture this, it's 12:50, and you're dragged before a crowd in the village square, hands bound, the stolen loaf clutched by a furious baker. The mainstream fact here is that trial by ordeal was a real practice in early medieval Europe, especially before the 13th century when formal courts became more common. The idea was simple. God would reveal your guilt or innocence through a physical test. For a bread thief like you, that might mean plunging your hand into boiling water to grab a stone. If your burns healed cleanly within days, you were innocent. If they festered, guilty as charged, divine justice, medieval style, no pressure. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some English villages, they used trial by bread for minor crimes like theft. You'd be forced to swallow a consecrated piece of bread or cheese blessed by a priest. If you choked, God was calling you out as a thief. If you swallowed smoothly, you were off the hook. Historians still argue whether choking was more about nerves or actual divine intervention. But imagine the stress. You're standing there, chewing dry bread, with a crowd betting on whether you'll gag. That loaf you stole doesn't seem worth it now, does it? You're in the square, the air thick with tension. The priest is muttering prayers, the baker's glaring, and the crowd's whispering about your fate. Trial by ordeal wasn't just about punishment, it was a spectacle. The church backed these rituals, claiming God's judgment was infallible, but they were also a way to scare folks like you into behaving. You're staring at that boiling pot or that sacred bread, wondering if your sticky fingers are about to betray you. And here's a grim little joke to keep it light. Why did the thief hate trial by bread? Because he couldn't stomach the consequences. But seriously, choking in front of everyone? That's a bad day. The ordeal's rules were strict. If it's the hot water test, you plunge your hand in, the crowd counting the seconds. If it's bread, you're chewing like your life depends on it. Because it might. In some regions, like parts of France, they'd tie you up and toss you in a river. Float and you're guilty, sink and you're innocent, but possibly drowned. Oops. The logic was brutal and the stakes were high. You're not just fighting for your freedom, you're fighting to prove you're not cursed by God. And the baker? He's loving this, watching you squirm for stealing his rye. These trials were fading by the late 13th century. Pope Innocent III banned many in 1215, but in smaller villages they lingered. You're lucky if you're in a town with a proper court, but out here, it's you, the priest, and a very judgmental crowd. The loaf's long gone, maybe crumbled in your pocket, but the consequences are just starting. You're praying for a miracle, but the water's boiling, the bread's dry, and the village is watching. Will you pass the test, or will God's verdict send you straight to the pillory we talked about earlier? Let's find out what happens next. You're still reeling from that close call with the trial by ordeal, the memory of boiling water or that cursed dry bread still fresh in your mind. You barely escaped God's judgment, but the village isn't done with you yet. You stole that loaf, and now you're being marched through the muddy square, the baker's accusations ringing in your ears. The crowd parts, and there it is, the pillory, a wooden contraption waiting to lock you in like a human trophy of shame. Welcome to the medieval world's favourite public punishment for bread thieves, where humiliation is the main course, and you're the entertainment. Imagine it's 1275, and you're shoved toward the pillory, your wrists and neck clamped into its rough wooden holes. The mainstream fact here is that pillories were a common punishment across medieval Europe, especially in England and France, for minor crimes like bread theft. You'd be locked in for hours, sometimes days, while the town went to town, literally hurling insults, rotten eggs, or worse. The goal wasn't just to punish, it was to make you a laughingstock, a warning to anyone else eyeing the baker's stall. Your face is red, your back aches, and the crowd's not exactly chanting your name. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some English towns, pillory time came with a bonus. Local kids were encouraged to toss mud or spoiled food as practice for good aim. Talk about adding insult to injury. Historians still argue whether this was more about community bonding or just plain cruelty, but either way you're dodging a mouldy cabbage while a snotty kid cheers his perfect shot. That loaf you nabbed? It's starting to feel like the most expensive snack of your life. The pillory's not just a physical trap, it's a social guillotine. You're stuck there, head and hands immobilised, while merchants, neighbours, and even your cousin who never liked you point and jeer. The baker's probably front and centre, arms crossed, enjoying the show. You can still smell the bread on your fingers, but now it's mixed with the stench of whatever's being thrown your way. And here's a little joke to ease the sting. Why did the bread thief hate the pillory? Because it was a real pain in the neck. Okay, maybe not your best moment, but you're not exactly laughing either. This punishment's designed to break your spirit. In bigger towns, they'd post a sign above you. Thief of bread, it might say. In case anyone missed the memo. Your reputation's toast, and good luck finding work or a friendly face after this. In some places, like parts of Germany, they'd spice it up by tying the stolen loaf around your neck, letting it dangle like a badge of shame. You're hungry, humiliated, and wondering how one crusty roll led to this. The crowd's relentless. Someone's shouting about your sticky fingers, and a dog sniffing at the crumbs on your tunic. The pillory's also a reminder of how bread theft wasn't just about you and the baker. It was about the community's trust, the fragile balance of food in a world where famine was always a bad harvest away. You're not just a thief, you're a threat to that balance, and the pillory's there to make sure everyone knows it. As the hours drag on, your neck's sore, your legs are numb, and the jeers are fading into a dull roar. You're starting to think maybe stealing wasn't worth it. But the day's not over, and the village has more ways to make you pay. Will you ever get out of this mess, or is the pillory just the start of your troubles? You're finally free from that wretched pillory, your neck aching and your pride in tatters, the jeers of the crowd still echoing in your ears. The stolen loaf that landed you in this mess is long gone, but the village isn't done teaching you a lesson. You're trudging through the muddy streets now, trying to avoid the judgmental stares of neighbours who definitely won't be inviting you to dinner anytime soon. Let's shift gears and step into the world of bakers' guilds. Powerful groups that didn't just bake bread but guarded it like a fortress, making sure thieves like you faced the full weight of their influence. These weren't just bakers, they were medieval bread police, and you're about to learn how their rules kept you in check. It's around 1280, and you're slinking past a bakery, its shutters closed tight, the faint glow of an oven flickering inside. The mainstream fact here is that bakers' guilds, common in cities across medieval Europe like London and Paris, were powerful trade organisations by the 13th century. They set strict standards for bread quality, weight, and price, ensuring members followed the assize of bread and ale we talked about earlier. Steal from a guild member, and you weren't just crossing one baker, you were picking a fight with a whole network of flour-dusted enforcers who could ruin your life. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some guilds, especially in Italy, had secret hand signals to warn each other about suspected thieves prowling the markets. Imagine you're eyeing a loaf, and the baker flashes a quick gesture to his buddy across the square. Suddenly, you're being watched by every apron in town. Historians still argue whether these signals were real or just rumours spread to scare off would-be thieves, but you're feeling paranoid now, aren't you? Every baker's glance feels like a coded message, and you're wondering if they've already marked you as trouble. These guilds were no joke. They controlled who could bake, sell, or even touch bread in their towns. You want to be a baker? Good luck. Guilds required years of apprenticeship, hefty fees, and oaths to uphold their rules. Stealing from one of their members was like stealing from a medieval mafia. They'd haul you before a guild court, where you'd face fines, banishment from the market, or even a stint in the stocks we'll get to later. You're walking past that bakery, and you can feel the guild's invisible grip. Bakers talking in low voices, their eyes tracking you like hawks. Here's a quick joke to lighten the mood. Why did the thief avoid guild bakers? Because they always needed you to confess. Guilds also had pull with local lords and magistrates. If you stole a loaf, they could push for harsher punishments, like public shaming or worse, to protect their trade. Bread was their power, and they guarded it fiercely. In some cities, like Florence, guilds even had their own patrols. Think armed bakers roaming the streets, ready to nab you for swiping a crust. You're hungry, sure, but the guild's reach makes that loaf seem like more trouble than it's worth. And they didn't just stop at punishment, they'd blacklist you, making it impossible to buy bread legally in town, starvation or exile. Not great options. As you slink through the streets, you notice the guild's seal on the bakery door, a reminder of their authority. The air smells of fresh bread, but it's a taunt now, not a temptation. You're learning fast that stealing isn't just about dodging the baker, it's about dodging an entire system rigged to keep you in line. The guild's watching, the market's buzzing, and your empty stomach's begging for a break. Will you risk another grab, or are you starting to see why crossing these flour-covered overlords is a bad idea? You're still skulking through the village, the weight of the baker's guild from last time like a shadow over your shoulder, their invisible network making every loaf in sight feel like a trap. The streets are quieter now, the market's bustle fading as you pass stone buildings adorned with royal crests. That stolen bread from earlier? It's a distant memory, but its consequences keep chasing you. Now, you're about to learn how even kings got involved in the bread game, issuing decrees that made stealing a loaf not just a local crime, but a jab at the entire medieval order. Buckle up. You're about to see how royal power turned your hungry grab into a royal headache. It's roughly 1290, and you're standing outside a tavern, overhearing talk of the king's latest edict. The mainstream fact here is that monarchs across Europe, like England's Edward I, issued laws like the assize of bread and ale to control food markets. These royal decrees set bread prices based on grain costs, ensuring stability in times of scarcity. Stealing bread wasn't just a personal slight against the baker, it threatened the king's authority, as bread was the glue holding society together. Mess with it, and you're practically spitting in the crown's face. No wonder they didn't take kindly to thieves like you. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some English towns, royal officials called bread inspectors would parade through markets, weighing loaves and fining bakers for shortchanging customers. But if you stole one of those carefully weighed loaves, they'd chase you down like you'd nicked the king's crown jewels. Historians still argue whether these decrees were about feeding the poor or just keeping the masses from rioting, but either way you're feeling the king's gaze. That loaf you swiped is not just bread, it's a royal asset and you're in deep. You're lingering near the tavern, catching snippets of gossip about the king's laws. The air smells faintly of ale and baked goods, but you're too nervous to enjoy it. These decrees weren't just suggestions, they were enforced with royal muscle. Steal bread, and you could face the king's justices who travelled from town to town dispensing punishment. Fines were the least of it. Repeat offenders like you might lose a hand or get banished from the realm. Imagine trying to explain that to your family. The king's logic was clear. Bread kept people fed. People fed meant no revolts, and no revolts meant a happy throne. You're just a hungry peasant, but to the crown, you're a tiny cog in a very big machine. Here's a little joke to keep things light. Why did the king care about bread theft? Because he didn't want his subjects to loaf around. Okay, maybe not your finest hour, but you're not laughing either. You're too busy eyeing the town crier, who's nailing up a new decree about market crimes. The crowd's murmuring and you catch the words thieves and stocks. Remember that pillory from a few sections back? Yeah, it's starting to feel like your second home. The king's laws made sure every baker, merchant and nosy neighbour was on high alert, ready to turn you in. These royal decrees also tied bread to social rank. Fancy white manchip bread was for lords, while you're stuck dreaming of coarse rye. Steal the wrong loaf, and you're not just a thief. You're a peasant daring to touch the elite's food. That's a one-way ticket to trouble. You're slinking past the tavern now, the weight of royal authority pressing down. The baker's stall is far behind, but the king's reach is everywhere. His laws whispered in every market, enforced by every guard. Your stomach's still empty, and the idea of stealing again feels like poking a sleeping dragon. Will you risk it, or are you starting to see why bread was the crown's obsession? You're still creeping through the village, the weight of royal decrees from last time making every step feel like you're dodging the king's own spies. The tavern's chatter fades behind you, but the scent of bread lingers, pulling you toward a darker corner of town, alleys where the rules don't reach quite as far. You're hungry, desperate, and maybe just reckless enough to think stealing another loaf isn't the worst idea. But you're not alone. Welcome to the Thieves' Underground, a shadowy world of bread bandits who've turned snatching loaves into an art form. You're about to dive into their gritty network, where survival means outsmarting bakers, guilds, and even the crown. It's around 1295 and you're slipping into a narrow alley. the cobblestones slick with grime. The mainstream fact here is that medieval towns, especially larger ones like London or Bruges, often had informal networks of thieves who targeted markets for food, especially bread. These weren't Robin Hood's merry men. They were desperate folks, often organised, who knew hunger made people bold. Stealing bread wasn't just a solo act, it was a trade, with its own codes, hideouts, and even leaders who planned heists like medieval capers. You're brushing shoulders with these outcasts now, and they're eyeing you like you might be their next recruit, or their next snitch. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some French cities, thieves used trained dogs to snatch loaves from market stalls, darting through crowds while their owners played innocent. Picture a scruffy mutt bolting off with a rye loaf, and you're left wondering if you should applaud or run. Historians still argue whether these stories were exaggerated by paranoid bakers or actual tactics of cunning thieves, but you're in that alley, and a shifty guy with a dog is giving you a nod. Is he offering you a job or sizing you up for betrayal? Either way, you're in deep. The underground's not glamorous. You're crouched in a damp corner surrounded by ragged figures swapping tips on dodging market guards. One guy brags about swiping a loaf right under a baker's nose, using a kid as a distraction. Another mutters about a fence who trades stolen bread for tools or ale. The air smells of mould and desperation, but there's a strange camaraderie here. Everyone's hungry. Everyone's breaking the same laws we talked about earlier, like the king's decrees or the guild's rules. You're tempted to join them, but it's risky. Get caught, and you're not just facing the pillory from a few sections back. You're marked as part of a criminal ring, and that's a whole new level of trouble. Here's a quick joke to break the tension. Why did the thief join the bread bandits? Because he wanted to rise to the occasion. Okay, not your best moment, but you're too nervous to laugh. These thieves have tricks, slipping loaves into cloaks, bribing guards, or even swapping real bread for fake decoys to fool bakers. But they're not untouchable. The guilds we mentioned, they're cracking down, offering rewards for snitches. You're hearing whispers of raids, of thieves dragged to the stocks or worse. The guy with the dog is talking now, offering you a role in a market heist tomorrow. Your stomach screaming yes, but your head's flashing back to that boiling water from the trial by ordeal. This underground life is thrilling, but it's a tightrope. You're clutching a crumb from that stolen loaf, the one that started this mess. The alley's dark, the thief's voice is low, and the promise of more bread is tempting. But the king's laws, the guild's spies, and the baker's watchful eyes are out there, waiting. Do you join these bread bandits and risk it all? Or do you slip back into the light, hoping to outrun your hunger another day? You're slipping out of that grimy alley, the whispers of the bread thieves' underground still buzzing in your ears like a bad idea you can't shake. The promise of another stolen loaf is tempting, but the risk, those royal decrees and guild spies from before, keeps your feet moving toward the safer glow of the village square. The air shifts now, carrying the faint toll of church bells, and you're reminded that in this medieval world, even the church has a say in your bread-stealing saga. You're about to discover how holy men turned a crust of rye into a sacred matter, and how their laws made your sticky fingers a sin as much as a crime. It's around 1300, and you're passing a stone church, its stained glass glowing faintly in the dusk. The mainstream fact here is that the church in medieval Europe, particularly the Catholic Church, played a massive role in regulating daily life, including food. Bread wasn't just sustenance. It was a symbol of Christ's body in the Eucharist, making its theft a spiritual offence as well as a legal one. Steal a loaf, and you're not just crossing the baker or the king from earlier sections, you're practically thumbing your nose at God. The church could excommunicate you, barring you from sacraments and in the eyes of the village damning your soul. Heavy stuff for a hungry grab. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some monasteries, monks baked holy bread for the poor, but if you stole it, you might face a penance like fasting for days or scrubbing the church steps on your knees. Talk about divine payback. Historians still argue whether these punishments were about spiritual redemption or just the church flexing its muscle to control the masses, but you're feeling the pressure either way. You're standing outside that church now, the smell of incense mixing with the faint whiff of bread from a nearby alms table. Steal from that table, and you're not just a thief, you're a sinner. You're eyeing the church's bread basket meant for the destitute, but guarded by a stern monk who looks like he's seen his share of thieves. The church's laws were no joke. In some regions, like parts of Italy, Stealing sacred bread could land you in a church court where you'd face public confession or even flogging. You're remembering that trial by ordeal from a few sections back. Yeah, the church loved those divine tests too. They'd make you swear on relics or walk over hot coals to prove your innocence. Fail, and you're not just outcast from the village, you're outcast from heaven. You're hungry, but is a loaf worth risking eternal BBQ? Here's a little joke to lighten the mood. Why did the monk guard the bread? Because he didn't want any unholy rollers. Okay, maybe you're too nervous to laugh with that monk's stare boring into you. The church didn't just punish, it preached. Sermons warned that stealing bread was stealing from God's bounty, and you're starting to feel like every eye in the village, holy or not, is on you. The church also worked with the guilds and lords we talked about, forming a trifecta of trouble for thieves like you. They'd report you to the manor court or push for harsher penalties, all while waving the cross over your head. As you linger near the church, the bells toll again, slow and heavy like a warning. The bread on that alms table looks so close, but the monk's watching, and the weight of divine judgment feels heavier than the king's decrees or the guild's spies. You're still hungry, still desperate, but now you're wondering if stealing is worth a one-way ticket to spiritual exile. Do you dare snatch that holy loaf, or do you shuffle on hoping the church's wrath doesn't follow you next? You're standing in the doorway of your crumbling hut, barefoot on the cold, packed earth, the damp straw smell clinging to the air. It's 1305, and you're a peasant, tied to this land, to this life, where every day is a quiet battle against the hunger gnawing at your insides. That stolen loaf we talked about earlier? It's gone now, just a memory of crust and fleeting fullness. But here, in the dim flicker of your home, hunger isn't a crime to be judged. It's a slow, relentless ache. You feel the desperation driving peasants like you to steal, to risk everything for a single bite. So, settle in, let's drift through this together, and imagine what it's like when your stomach's louder than your thoughts. Picture it. The village is asleep mostly, except for the faint clatter of the Lord's ovens baking bread you'll never taste. Your hut's walls are thin, letting the night's chill seep in, and your stomach growls again. Rude little thing, waking the baby bundled in the corner. This isn't just a bad day, it's your life. Historically, famines hit medieval Europe hard, especially around now, the 13th and 14th centuries. Crop failures, wars, and a chilly shift called the Little Ice Age turned harvests into prayers that went unanswered. Bread's not just a treat, it's survival. For you, it's the line between hauling stones for the Lord tomorrow or collapsing in the mud. The feudal system's got you pinned. You work the land, the Lord takes the grain, and you're left scraping by on watery gruel and hope. Taxes grind you down further, and the enclosure of common fields where you used to graze a goat or two means even less to eat. Your ribs are starting to show, and it's not a fashion statement. Now, here's a quirky little tidbit to chew on. Some peasants swore that tucking a bread crust under your pillow could keep hunger dreams away. Sweet, right? Except you're wide awake staring at the leaky thatch, thinking that crust would be better off in your mouth than under your head. Superstition or desperation? Historians still bicker about it, but you're too empty to join the debate. The scent of baking bread wafts over from the manor, warm, yeasty, with a whisper of wood smoke. And it's torture. You can almost feel the chew of it, the way it'd settle that ache. But that bread's for the Lord's table, maybe the priest's blessing. You get the burnt edges if you're lucky, and even those are running out. This hunger's more than a growl, it's a heaviness in your chest. Your kids are shrinking, their eyes duller every day, and you're starting to see why stealing's not just a crime, it's a stand. It's you saying, I'm human too. The thieves' underground we've whispered about before is looking less like sin and more like salvation. But the risks, oh, they're heavy. The pillory's splinters, the guild's fines, the church's lectures, they're all waiting to pounce. Still, as you shift on your cold feet, you're wondering if one loaf could buy your family a week. Here's a little joke to lighten the load. Why'd the peasant glare at the bakery? He was loafing around, waiting for a crumb of luck. Not your best laugh, but hunger's not exactly a comedian's muse. Scholars still argue over this. How much did hunger really fuel medieval crime? Some say it was everything. Starvation turned honest folks into outlaws. Others reckon poverty was just one thread in a messy tapestry of rebellion. You don't have time for their quill scratching, you're living it. The bailiff's due tomorrow, expecting rent you can't pay, and your hands are as empty as your belly. Stealing's starting to feel less like a choice and more like a dare. Another joke, because why not? What's a peasant's favourite song? Need me, feed me. Too bad the Lord's not taking requests. The village hums with the same tension you feel. Hungry whispers, sidelong glances at the bakery. Rebellion's in the air, but so's the memory of crushed uprisings. Homes torched, families broken. You're on that edge now, the path to the bakery glowing in the moonlight. You've walked it 100 times, but tonight it's calling you. Your stomach's shouting, do it, while your heart mutters, wait. Stealing bread might fill you up, but it could empty everything else. Your freedom, your life. Third joke, soft as a whisper. Why don't peasants bake? Because the Lord's got all the dough. A quiet chuckle, maybe, as you weigh the scales of hunger and fear. So here you are, a peasant in 1305, hunger pushing you toward a line you never thought you'd cross. The bakery's close, the night's dark, and the desperation's real. Will you step out, or will the shadows of the law pull you back? That's where we'll drift next, into the consequences, the fallout, the moment hunger meets justice. You're standing at the back of a dimly lit hall, the air heavy with the scent of damp wood and the press of unwashed bodies. It's 1310 somewhere in the English countryside, and you've squeezed into the Lord's manor to watch the manorial court in action. Today's case, a bread thief, caught red-handed facing judgment. The room buzzes with anticipation. Peasants jostle for a better view, a merchant mutters about wasted time, and a couple of monks whisper prayers in the corner. You're here for the spectacle, but the stakes feel real. The thief, a scrawny lad with dirt-streaked cheeks, is shoved to the front, wrists bound with rough twine. He's trembling, his eyes wide with fear, and you can't help but feel the tension coil in your gut. One misstep and he's done for. Pilloried, fined, or worse. You're just glad it's not you up there. The Lord looms on a raised dais, wrapped in furs despite the stuffy heat, his face carved from stone. He's the law here, judge, jury, and if the mood strikes him, executioner. Manorial courts like this were the heartbeat of medieval justice, especially for rural folk. Held every few weeks, they dealt with everything from land disputes to petty theft, like this sorry loaf snatcher. The Lord's word is final, though his decisions often hinge on his temper or the crowd's chatter. You glance at the thief, his gaze darting like a trapped rat's, and wonder if he'll get a fair hearing. Probably not. This isn't a day for mercy. Here's a quirky twist. In some manors, lords let a jury of local peasants weigh in, but don't be fooled. These were no impartial panels. Picture your grumpiest neighbour and that busybody widow down the lane, all loyal to the Lord deciding your fate. Historians still bicker over whether these courts were about justice or just keeping the rabble in check. Right now, it feels like a show of power, and the thief's the unlucky star. The Lord's bailiff, a hulking man with a face like a slapped ham, steps forward and bellows the charge. Stole a rye loaf from Baker John's stall worth twopence. The crowd gasps. Twopence might be a day's wage for a labourer. The thief mumbles something about hunger and sick kids, but the Lord's expression doesn't soften. He's heard every excuse in the book. Your feet shift on the straw-strewn floor, the prickly stalks jabbing through your thin shoes. The hall's walls are draped with tapestries, hunting scenes, naturally, since lords love a good chase. But this thief isn't running. He's cornered. The bailiff calls witnesses. Baker John, red-faced and spitting mad, swears the lad grabbed the loaf and bolted. A market guard nods, adding that he nabbed the boy hiding behind a cart, crumbs still clinging to his chin. The evidence piles up like kindling, and you can almost smell the smoke of his doom. Here's a little jest to lighten the mood. Why'd the thief pick that cart? He thought it was a real good hiding spot. You'd chuckle, but the air's too thick with nerves. The Lord drums his fingers on the armrest, impatient, while the crowd mutters. Some call for a flogging, others just want the show to move along. The thief gets his turn to speak, his voice a shaky whisper. My lord, I was starving. My sister's ill, please. The Lord cuts him off with a sharp wave. Hunger's no excuse, he snaps. If I let every desperate soul steal, we'd have anarchy. The crowd nods. You're chewing your lip torn. Hunger's a devil you know, But the law's the law, and here it's as unyielding as the stone floor. The lord leans forward, eyes narrowing. You'll pay a fine, 6pence, or spend a day in the stocks. The thief's face crumples. 6pence is a fortune for him, and he's got nothing. The stocks it is then. Public humiliation, complete with jeers and rotting vegetables. You wince, picturing it. But then, a twist. A priest glides forward, robes brushing the floor. "My lord, the church begs mercy. The boy's confessed and done penance. Let him work off the debt." The lord scowls. Holy interference isn't his favourite. The crowd splits. Some cheer for grace, others jeer. Here's the debate. Should the church meddle in secular justice? Some argue it tempered the harshness of these courts. Others say it just muddled things. You watch the lord wrestle with it, pride clashing with the priest's plea. At last he grunts. Fine, he works for the baker unpaid for a month, and pays a penny to the church for his sin. The thief slumps with relief, though a month under Baker John's glower won't be a picnic. Still, it beats the stocks. The hall empties out, the drama done, but you linger, mulling the boy's fate. He's dodged the worst, thanks to a priest's quiet words, but he's still bound by debt and shame. Will hunger drive him to steal again, or has this scare set him straight? The lord's already on to the next case, a spat over a stray pig as you slip outside. The cool air hits your face, a balm after the stuffy hall. The thief's led away, head bowed, and a pang of pity tugs at you. Hunger's a brutal foe, and justice here is rarely just. That's medieval life, raw, relentless, and always a little starved. You're stepping out of the manor's smoky hall, the thief's trial still buzzing in your mind like a fly you can't swat away. The cool night air hits your face, carrying the faint scent of baked bread from the village. Taunting, always taunting. That scrawny lad's fate working off his debt under the baker's scowl feels like a small mercy. But it's a reminder. Stealing bread doesn't just spark courtroom drama, it can unravel the whole market. Now, you're wandering back toward the village square, where the stalls are shuttered but the whispers of bread-weight scandals linger. You're about to dive into a world where bakers cheat the scales, and thieves like you pay the price for their tricks. It's around 13:15, and you're lingering near a baker's stall, now closed, its wooden counter scarred from years of haggling. The mainstream fact here is that bakers across medieval Europe, especially in England under the assize of bread and ale, face strict rules on loaf weight. If grain prices rose, loaves had to shrink, but only by exact measures. A baker caught selling underweight bread could face fines, the pillory, or even banishment from the trade. But here's the catch. Some bakers game the system, slipping stones into dough or selling hollow loaves to stretch their profits. You're eyeing the shuttered stall, wondering if that golden loaf you stole earlier was lighter than it looked. Did the baker cheat you before you cheated him? Here's a quirky tidbit. In some English towns, officials used a bizarre test to catch cheating bakers. They'd dunk suspect loaves in water. If they sank too fast, the bread was deemed adulterated with cheap fillers like sawdust. Yuck. Historians still argue whether these tests were reliable, or just a way to bully bakers into compliance, but you're imagining biting into a loaf and crunching on grit. No wonder people got mad enough to steal, or riot. You're standing there, the night quiet except for a distant dog's bark, and you can almost hear the outrage of customers who paid good coin for a loaf that was half air. Bakers weren't always the villains, though. They worked grueling hours, kneading dough in pre-dawn chill, their hands blistered from ovens. But greed, or desperation, could push them to cheat. You're picturing Baker John from the trial, maybe slipping a pebble into his dough to make weight, then cursing when you stole his honest loaf. The irony's thicker than his rye. If you got caught with a short-weighted loaf, you couldn't exactly march to the Lord and complain. Thieves don't get refunds. Here's a quick joke to lighten the mood. Why did the baker hide stones in his bread? He wanted to rock the market. Okay, you're not laughing. You're too busy wondering if every loaf in this village is a scam. These scandals weren't just about bakers and thieves. They stirred up the whole town. If word got out that a baker was cheating, customers would mob his stall demanding justice. You're remembering those royal decrees from a few sections back. Kings didn't mess around when it came to bread. Inspectors, called bread weighers, patrolled markets, checking loaves and fining anyone who dared skimp. Get caught, and you're not just paying coin, you're paraded through town with your faulty loaf hung around your neck like a criminal sign. The crowd loved it, shouting insults while you, the baker, wished you'd stuck to honest dough. You're kicking a loose cobblestone now, the village square empty but heavy with the ghosts of these scandals. Every loaf was a battleground. Bakers versus buyers, lords versus cheats, and thieves like you stuck in the middle. You're still hungry, the memory of that stolen crust fading fast. Do you risk another grab, knowing the baker might be cheating anyway? Or do you steer clear, wary of a system where everyone's gaming the scales, literal and not? The night's growing colder, and the next move's on you. You're still in the village square, the moon casting long shadows over the shuttered stalls, the memory of bread-weight scandals from last time making you squint at every loaf with suspicion. The night's cold, your breath puffing in the air, and your stomach's grumbling like it's got a personal grudge. You're starting to see why stealing bread was such a gamble, not just because of the baker's tricks or the king's laws, but because getting caught could land you right back in the village's favourite torture device, the stocks. You're trudging past one now, its wooden jaws waiting in the corner of the square, and you can't help but shudder. Steal a rye loaf, and this is where you end up. Locked in, laughed at, and regretting every crumb. It's around 1320, and you're imagining yourself in those stocks, your ankles trapped, your back aching as you hunch forward. The mainstream fact here is that stocks were a go-to punishment for minor crimes like bread theft across medieval Europe, especially in England and Germany. Unlike the pillory, which clamped your neck and wrists, stocks locked your feet, leaving you sitting in the mud while the town had its fun. You'd be there for hours, maybe days, with passers-by tossing insults, spoiled turnips, or worse. The goal? Shame you into submission and warn others not to follow your lead. You're staring at those stocks now, and they look like a bad omen. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some villages, the stocks were placed near the church, so Sunday crowds could gawk at you after Mass. Nothing says repent like a tomato to the face while the priest drones on about sin. Historians still argue whether this was more about deterrence or just public entertainment, but you're not thrilled either way. You're picturing yourself stuck there, kids giggling as they lob muddy clods, and the baker you stole from grinning like he's won the harvest festival. That rye loaf? It's not tasting so great now, is it? You're hovering near the stocks, the wood worn smooth by countless thieves before you. The square's quiet, but you can imagine the daytime chaos. Merchants shouting, dogs yapping, and a crowd ready to make you the day's gossip. The punishment's not just physical, it's a social gut punch. Your neighbours, the ones you shared ale with last week, are now pointing and laughing. Your reputation's as good as the mud you're sitting in. Here's a little joke to ease the sting. Why did the thief hate the stocks? Because they kept him on his toes. Literally. Okay, you're not laughing. You're too busy imagining the ache in your legs and the sting of a well-aimed apple. The stocks weren't random cruelty. They were part of the system we've been unravelling. Guilds, kings, and now the village itself, all working to keep bread sacred and thieves in line. Stealing that loaf wasn't just about hunger. It was a middle finger to the community's trust. You're remembering the manorial court from a couple sections back, where the Lord's word was law. Get caught again, and you might not get off with a month's labour. Repeat offenders could face branding or banishment, and you're not keen on either. The stocks are a warning. One more grab and you're not just a thief. You're a pariah. As you slink away from the stocks, the village feels smaller, the shadows sharper. The baker's stall is shuttered, but you can still smell that faint yeasty promise of bread. Your stomach's begging you to try again, but the stock's silhouette looms like a ghost. Do you risk another theft knowing this public shaming's waiting? Or do you shuffle home, hunger gnawing, hoping tomorrow's less cruel? The choice is yours, but the village is watching and those stocks aren't going anywhere. You're slipping away from the village square, the stock's ominous silhouette fading into the night, but their threat lingers like a bad dream. The air's thick with the scent of wood smoke and that ever-present tease of fresh bread, drifting from somewhere beyond the village's edge. Your stomach's still growling, a constant reminder of why you stole that loaf in the first place, but the memory of the pillory, the court, and those guilds keeps your hands in your pockets, for now. You're heading toward the quieter outskirts, where a monastery's stone walls loom under the moonlight. Monks, it turns out, had their own rules about bread, and stealing from them was a whole different kind of trouble. Let's step into their world, where bread's not just food, it's a sacred trust, and you're about to learn how their laws could make your life even messier. It's around 1325, and you're creeping past the monastery's gate, the faint chant of evening prayers humming through the air. The mainstream fact here is that monasteries across medieval Europe, especially Benedictine ones, were major producers of bread, not just for monks but for the poor and pilgrims. They baked in massive ovens, churning out coarse rye for charity and finer loaves for holy rituals. Stealing from their stores wasn't just theft, it was a sin against God's charity, and monks weren't shy about enforcing their rules. If you nabbed a loaf from their alms basket, you could face spiritual penalties, like excommunication, or very earthly ones, like a public flogging in the monastery courtyard. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some monasteries baked penance bread, deliberately hard and tasteless, for thieves to eat as punishment while kneeling for hours. Imagine chewing on what feels like a brick while a monk lectures you about sin. Historians still argue whether this was about reforming souls or just humiliating the desperate, but you're eyeing that monastery gate, wondering if the bread inside is worth the risk. The monk's charity table sits just beyond, piled with loaves for the needy. You're definitely needy, but their idea of justice might leave you regretting that grab more than the pillory ever did. You're lingering in the shadows, the stone wall cold against your back. The monastery's quiet, but it's a watchful kind of quiet. Monks aren't as soft as their robes look. They've got lay brothers, burly types who guard the stores, and they're not above chasing you down if you try anything. You're remembering that church lecture from a few sections back, how stealing bread was a one-way ticket to spiritual trouble. Here, it's worse. These loaves are blessed, meant for the poor or the altar. Snatch one, and you're not just a thief, you're a heretic in their eyes. Here's a little joke to ease the tension. Why don't monks share their bread? Because they're saving it for a higher purpose. Okay, you're not laughing. You're too busy weighing the odds of outrunning a monk with a stick. Monastic rules were strict. Some abbeys had their own courts for minor crimes, and a bread thief like you might be sentenced to scrub pots or dig ditches for weeks. In extreme cases, they'd hand you over to the manor court we saw earlier, where the Lord's justice wasn't exactly forgiving. The monks also kept meticulous records, every loaf baked, every crumb given out. Steal from them, and they'd know exactly what was missing. You're picturing a monk with a quill, tallying loaves like a heavenly accountant ready to report you to the abbot. The charity table's tempting, but the price feels steeper than the king's fines or the guild's wrath. As you hover near the gate, the prayers grow softer, the night colder. The bread's so close, but the monastery's rules are closer, woven into the same system of control. Kings, guilds, church, all guarding their precious loaves. Your hunger's screaming, but so's the memory of the stocks, the trial, the shame. Do you dare slip inside for a loaf, or do you slink back to the village, hoping hunger doesn't win this round? The monastery's walls aren't talking, but their silence feels like a warning. You're slinking away from the monastery's looming walls, the faint chant of monks fading into the night as you head back toward the village. The memory of their sacred bread and the punishments for stealing it has your stomach twisting, but hunger's still got you in its grip. The air's sharp now, carrying the distant roar of voices, not the usual market chatter, but something angrier. Rawer. You're stumbling toward the village square, where torches flicker and a crowd's gathering, shouting about bread, or the lack of it. Welcome to the chaos of urban bread riots, where desperation like yours boils over, and stealing a loaf feels less like a crime and more like a battle cry. You're about to join a mob that's ready to tear the system apart. It's around 1330, and the square's alive with fury. Peasants, labourers, even a few merchants are packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces lit by torchlight, yelling about soaring grain prices and shrinking loaves. The mainstream fact here is that bread riots were a real threat in medieval Europe, especially in cities like London or Paris during the 14th century. Bad harvests, wars, or greedy lords could drive grain prices sky high, leaving folks like you with empty bellies and shorter tempers. When bakers or lords hoarded bread or jacked up prices, crowds took to the streets, looting stalls or storming granaries. You're in the thick of it now, pushed forward by the mob's tide, their shouts drowning out your own hunger pangs. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some French riots, women led the charge, wielding rolling pins like weapons to demand fair bread prices. Picture a baker cowering as a baker's wife, ironic, right, swings her pin at his stall. Historians still argue whether these riots were spontaneous outbursts or organised rebellions, but you're not debating theory. You're dodging elbows, your heart racing as the crowd surges toward a baker's shop. The smell of bread is everywhere, but it's not tempting now. It's fuel for the fire. You're remembering the weight scandals from a few sections back. Maybe this baker's been cheating, and the mob's had enough. Either way, you're caught in their current, and it's exhilarating and terrifying. The mob's chanting for fair loaves and justice, but it's less about law and more about survival. You're pressed against a cart, the wood splintering under the crowd's weight. A woman beside you screams about her starving kids, her voice cracking like dry bread. The baker's barricaded his door, but stones are flying and someone's already smashed a window. You're tempted to grab a loaf in the chaos. Who'd notice? But the memory of the stocks and the monastery's rules keeps you frozen. Here's a quick joke to cut the tension. Why did the rioters storm the bakery? They wanted to raise some dough. Okay, no one's laughing. The air's too thick with rage and you're just trying to stay upright. These riots weren't just about hunger. They were a middle finger to the system. Kings, guilds, monks, all hoarding bread while you starve. The Lord's guards are circling now, their spears glinting, but the crowd's too big, too angry. You hear a crash, someone's tipped over a stall, and loaves scatter like gold coins. You could grab one, blend into the chaos, but the guards are closing in, and you know what happens to rioters caught stealing. Flogging, branding, or worse. You're remembering the manorial court, the pillory, all those warnings piling up like stones in your gut. The mob's your shield, but it's also a trap. One wrong move, and you're not just a thief, you're a rebel. As the crowd surges, you're pushed closer to the bakery's shattered door. The smell of bread's overwhelming, and your hands itch to act. The mob's shouting, the guards are shouting back, and you're caught in the middle, hunger and fear at war. Do you join the riot, snatch a loaf and risk it all? Or do you slip away, hoping the mob's fury doesn't swallow you whole? The square's a tinderbox, and you're one spark from trouble.